want to thank everybody for coming this morning. When I woke up, I thought we might have more of the chairs filled. I don't know if that's because more people are tuning in on the webcast on this cloudy, dismal day, or if the cost study was so clear and compelling that people didn't see a reason to come out for this presentation. For those of you that may not know me, my name is Scott Wiener. I'm the Deputy for Markets and Innovation at DPS. And again, I want to thank you for coming, both here in Albany as well as all of you participating on the webcast. I want to also express the appreciation of the commissioners and the staff of DPS for all the work and contribution that you're doing. Although it may not always seem it, we are very mindful of the fact that there are a number of proceedings that are taking place in parallel, and that it's putting a great deal of tasks and burdens on you and your colleagues, and we appreciate all that effort, and we will be incorporating it into our reports and recommendations to the Commission. Today, we wanted to have an opportunity to provide an overview in person in real time of the CES cost study, and importantly provide an opportunity for those of you here in Albany as well as those of you participating by webcast to have an opportunity to ask questions and probe a little deeper beyond the pages of the report. You all should have a copy of the agenda, which we think is fairly clear. Today's format essentially will be that of presentations followed by questions and answers. We'll have two sessions of Q&A, one before lunch, one after lunch. I've been assigned the task of moderating the question and answer period, which I'm anticipating to be a very simple task because, as you can see, there's a podium here. We'll ask people to please use the podium. You can form a line or wait till there's opportunity. For those of you that want to participate through the webcast, you may submit questions by email, and I'll be repeating this, but you can send your email questions to ces@dps.ny.gov. That's ces@dps.ny.gov. I think that both the purpose as well as the report is very straightforward, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on context, but I do want to point out that in the afternoon session, in addition to or following the presentation of the components of the cost study report, we will also be having a presentation which is really in response to some questions that were raised at the time of the release of the LSR options paper dealing with utility-owned generation. And that will be occurring at around 2:10, 2:15 today. And we'll be taking a look at some modeling that was done by the Climate Policy Institute to respond to some of the questions we had received at that time. And we wanted to be able to provide that opportunity today. With all that said, I think we can jump into the substance of the meeting, and I will be turning it over to NYSERDA, my colleagues from NYSERDA. So, Carl, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks, Scott, and thanks, everyone. Good morning. So my name is Carl Moss. I'm our Director of Energy and Environmental Analysis at NYSERDA. There are going to be a few of us speaking this morning. I'll give you an overview of some of the key findings from our cost study, and then we'll walk you through increasing layers of detail. And as Scott mentioned, we're looking to save questions until the end of the morning session, and then we'll do a second Q&A at the end of the afternoon session. So why don't we jump right in? Okay, so just so we're all level set and remind ourselves why we're here. So the Clean Energy Standard Cost Study complements our Clean Energy Standard staff white paper. I know many in this room have already taken part in some previous technical conferences that have covered a number of the qualitative policy issues that surround the CES. So this particular presentation and the focus today really is on the cost study, which is our new component. And for those who To make sure we're all here together, the overall objective is a 50% renewable electricity grid by 2030. But we're also looking to maintain carbon savings from our nuclear plants that are fully licensed. So this work builds on the state's nation-leading efforts. In our energy plan, we set out a goal of 40 by 30, and we reinforced our existing goal of 80 by 50. So that's really our framework. That sets our measuring stick of the scale of these initiatives, and 50 by 30 is a critical piece of that. And then obviously, we're not only interested in greenhouse gases, we also are interested in the health benefits that come from a zero-emission resource and the economic growth that can also come from this work. So the name is pretty clear. It's a cost study. So we're looking at what is the above-market costs that these resources might require. We're also looking at some of the benefits and monetizing those benefits and looking at net costs and benefits of this potential policy. But we're also, in a lot of cases, more interested in how these outputs might change given different cost drivers. So we're looking over many years, and part of our goal here was to help inform our commissioners as they look at what's really driving costs, what's really driving benefits. So again, a lot of the emphasis of what we'll have today is looking at the impacts of the key cost drivers. And the key output we're looking at is customer bills. We also will present some information on wholesale spend. But really, as we look at different sensitivities and look to inform all of you and also the commissioners, we're looking at bill impacts. And again, why are we doing that? We're doing that to assist in the most cost-effective design of a clean energy standard. Okay, so to jump right into the heart of it, our results summary. Even in this period of lower electricity prices due to our historically low natural gas prices, New York can meet its clean energy targets with less than 1% impact on electricity bills in our near term. And for those of you who are wondering how that translates, for a typical residential customer, that's on average $1 a month. So again, when we look over our near term, which focuses on our analysis through 2023, we see that there's a $1.3 billion public investment that would be required to bring on these resources. And the generation of emission-free electricity from those resources leads to a benefit of $3.1 billion in carbon benefits. We go into quite some detail in the report and kind of where that comes from. It's built upon the BCA, the Benefit Cost Analysis Order, that came out in January, where the Commission approved the use of the U.S. EPA's social cost of carbon. So that's where our valuation comes from. So when we look at these benefits and weigh them against the costs, we see that the overall policy has a $1.8 billion net benefit. I also just wanted to spend a minute, and we emphasized it in our report, but that we don't see the CES as a policy in isolation. It's a critical piece of REV, and it complements the other policies. When we look at the activities that will be brought about under our Clean Energy Fund, we see that the Clean Energy Fund itself is designed to reduce ratepayer collections over time, and we see that furthermore, the activities from the CEF will help to bring down costs of achieving our renewable energy goals. So we see a close complement between our Clean Energy Fund activities and this new CES. Further ways that we see overlap and complementarity is REV will cause expansion of our distributed resources and enable integration with the electric grid in a way that decreases costs, but also, more importantly, creates a nimble grid that can respond to intermittent resources. So really, there's the importance of the new market structures that are going to be created to help allow us to get to this level of renewable energy. And then the CES supports the development of a vibrant clean energy market, provides the scale and certainty necessary for a broad competition that encourages private investment and reduces costs. So just want to take a minute to go at a high level over some of the key findings. So we focused our analysis and the conclusions in this study on the period through 2023. That coincides with the timing of the periodic reviews that we expect. It also recognizes that going all the way out to 2030 is highly uncertain. So everything from natural gas prices to technology cost declines, our uncertainty grows with time. So we emphasize our near-term analysis, which was through 2023. We do provide in the study some analysis out to 2030. You'll see some graphs today to 2030, but really the focus of where we're looking is out to 2023. So when we look at that time period, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at what are the key drivers of costs. And a number of these issues were brought up in the white paper and previously in the LSR options paper. But really, as we see it, some of the key drivers are the procurement structure. So that's looking at bundled PPAs or power purchase agreements. So that's a renewable energy credit plus the energy that generator makes versus only procuring our REC or the renewable energy credit. So the procurement structure is a very critical issue that we look at. We also looked at energy prices and interest rates as key input drivers. Technology costs are a key input. Energy use, so the actual load. Obviously, the less load there is, the lower the amount of renewables that are going to be required. So there's a critical interaction there. And then federal tax credits provide an important funding stream that will help to bring down the cost for New York State. Okay, so looking at some of the outputs of that work. So what we found is that the CES is able to balance cost impacts, and it results in significant net benefits to New York, as I mentioned, the 1.8 near-term benefits. The procurement structure and the total energy use significantly impact costs, and critical for us as we're informing the state is we also have an ability to impact those two drivers. So the procurement structure is one that we can help to set in policy. And again, our total energy use is one that we're complementarily trying to control and to even reduce over time through our Clean Energy Fund and other initiatives. Also critically important are future energy prices, which are highly uncertain. Interest rates and technology cost variability are drivers, but for the near-term analysis, what we showed is that they're not critical drivers to our output. What that reinforced both in terms of 2023 and 2030 is that a technology neutral approach, so one that doesn't select key technologies but allows the market to bring forth those solutions, gives us the kind of flexibility that means if one doesn't get cheaper over time, others will be able to backfill. So that's another important part of our output. Finally, federal tax credits, our work reinforces that they are significant. So in sum, a combination of low energy prices, low interest rates, and available tax credits presents a favorable environment for near-term investment in renewables. So that's the quick overview. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Eric, and I'll let folks introduce themselves briefly and then jump into their slides.
Thanks, Carl. My name is Eric Scherer. I'm a senior advisor with NYSERDA, and last Christmas, Scott's Christmas present to me was to get to spend the next 3 months with the cost study. So I'm thrilled to be able to share some of the fun with you today. And I will do that by going into the cost study results in a bit more detail. You've already heard the headline messages from Carl, and I will try to flesh out some of those key findings. First, a couple of framing comments. Just a reminder about the proposed tier structure in the Clean Energy Standard. We have 3 tiers, 4 if you count the sub-tiers in Tier 2A, and the cost study examines each of those. The first tier is the one for deployment of new renewables to get us to the 2030 target. Tier 2 is aimed at not just making sure that we get new renewables, but also that we keep what we already have. And Tier 3 reflects the importance of maintaining current nuclear generation as a way of safeguarding those carbon emissions. Our analytical approach to each of those tiers will be outlined by following speakers in more detail, but just as a quick introductory comment, for Tier 1, we carried out analysis on the basis of assessment of the auction system similar to main tier auctions that we've run in the past. We built a least cost supply curve model that allows us to assess what kinds of installations would come forward under future auctions. For Tier 2A, analysis asked the question, what are the revenue opportunities for renewables outside New York, and therefore what we have to offer to make sure that those renewables stay here in New York State rather than exporting. For Tier 2B, that tier reflects renewables that have less export opportunities. For that tier, the analysis looked at what those kinds of renewables have been paid in other territories historically. And finally, for Tier 3, the analysis looked at the likely costs of nuclear generation going forward and based the Tier 3 analysis on that. I'll race through these framing comments just as a reminder mostly of what Carl has already said. The cost analysis looks at what we call gross program costs as a starting point, the effective.
I want to interrupt you just for 1 second because to the folks in the control room, we've gotten word from some of the people that are watching on the web that the slides need to be focused better, that they're not coming across sharply on the web. So for who's ever in the control room, if you could attend to that, we'd appreciate it. Sorry, Eric.
I will also do my best to talk you through what's actually on the screen in case that's still not working out. So I just wanted to quickly recap some of the framing points that Carl made. We're looking at gross program costs as the effective incentive payments made to generators. And we are also looking at net program costs after taking account of the carbon benefits. Carl also mentioned that our focus is going to be on the 2023 time frame with the occasional excursion into the longer-term 2030 time horizon. In terms of the kinds of cost indicators that I will be looking at with you in a moment, the cost study presented both annual costs but also aggregated costs. If you take the entire program costs and roll them up into a net present value figure, and then finally also presented numbers as the impact on total energy bills, and that's perhaps the most intuitive indicator, so I will be focusing on that one. And finally, as Carl said, we didn't just examine costs in the cost study as such, but in particular also as a way of looking how particular key drivers impact those costs depending on how key drivers such as energy prices might vary in one direction or another. A quick note on the overall targets. This is for Tier 1. On the screen, I'm showing the trajectory as proposed in the white paper to take us from where we are to the 2030 in Tier 1. And the point to note here is that the new renewables incentivized by Tier 1 don't start from scratch. We already, of course, have programs running that encourage new renewables, in particular New York Sun for behind-the-meter solar PV and the past main tier solicitations. And accordingly, the expectation for the first few years would be that it's those programs that actually deliver the initial Tier 1 targets, which makes sense because even if new renewables are incentivized today under the Clean Energy Standard, it takes a few years for those to actually hit the ground. And that being the case, there's also a good opportunity to note that even though, as I've just said, the initial years we would expect to see delivered through existing programs, also the assumptions made for setting the targets for those initial years rely on a forecast, an expectation of what those existing programs are likely to deliver for the first few years. And on the screen I'm showing on the left-hand side the bars that reflect the level of deployment used for the white paper targets for those initial years. But the middle and right-hand bars showing here reflect more updated forecasts of what we are likely to see coming forward under the main tier and New York Sun programs. And so this is an indication that as we go through time, these forecasts develop naturally. Projects might get delayed, interconnection issues might arise. So it is only to be expected that there's going to be some variation in the levels of deployment also for the initial years. And accordingly, the white paper mentioned a number of options for dealing with such uncertainty. And as we go through the process of designing and implementing the Clean Energy Standard, we will see that this issue will be addressed in the PSC's decisions. So back to the cost study, and sorry, still no costs. One final point before we get there. I thought it would also be interesting to take a quick look at the mix of technologies we expect to see coming forward. And what you see on the screen here shows the time frame to 2023. And admittedly, there's not too much of interest to note there, as has been in the past. In that within that time frame, the expectation is that deployment will be a mix of solar PV behind the meter and land-based wind. And so to throw up a little bit more for discussion, we're also showing the longer-term forecast coming out of the analysis to 2030, which does show a much wider mix of technologies. So here you see not just behind-the-meter solar PV under New York Sun, but also shown in yellow a significant chunk of utility-scale PV kicking in, and indeed also some offshore wind imports and new hydro. Just to note that on the left you see the numbers expressed in megawatts of capacity, and on the right-hand side in gigawatt hours of generation. And as you would expect, there is a discrepancy between the two, which is due to the different capacity factors of technology. So, for instance, solar PV has a relatively greater number of megawatts, but due to the relatively lower capacity factor, the generation amount of PV on the right-hand side is somewhat lower. So here we are, costs. Let me talk you through the slide on the screen, because it's the format that I'll be using throughout this presentation. As Carl mentioned, we are looking at costs as the impact of particular drivers on cost. So on this slide, we're looking at procurement structures. Procurement structures refer to the means by which we can procure the new renewables through auctions. And the main alternatives for doing so are firstly through so-called fixed rec auctions, which is the equivalent of what you've seen in the past main tier solicitations, where generators are offered a fixed top-up payment through the lifetime of the installation. The alternative, the main alternative that's been under discussion, and for those of you in the business, you will clearly be aware of last year's large-scale renewables options paper. Going into that, is the main alternative is so-called bundled PPAs, where instead of a fixed top-up payment, generators will have access to a fixed total payment comprising energy, capacity, and the top-up incentive, which as a fixed guaranteed total payment provides generators with a greater level of revenue certainty. So that's what we are examining on this slide, and a couple of further introductory comments. On the left-hand side, you're seeing the gross program costs reflected. On the right-hand side, the net program costs after taking account of carbon benefits. And finally, as regards to the timeline, you can see that the graph lines that I'm talking about in a moment are going up to 2023. That's, as discussed, the focus of the study. But then costs are reflected all the way through to 2042, which reflects a 20-year assumed lifetime of installations installed up to 2023. So, quick math question, 2023, and then a 20-year lifetime assumption gets us to 2042. So let's have a quick look at what those lines are actually saying. If we're looking at the left-hand side, the gross program costs, as you would expect, the lines show an upward cost as more new generation is deployed. The top line represents the fixed rec case, and the bottom line, the bundled PPA case. The first difference you're seeing there is, as I referred to earlier, the difference in risk profile. Bundled PPAs showing a lower level of risk and thus a lower level of cost. Then when we get to 2023, at that point, as I said, within the assumption of the study, only showing deployment to 2023, at that point we're stopping new renewables for the purpose of the numbers we're looking at here. So under a fixed rec scenario, it's then not surprising that you see a flat line going forward, the rec price being fixed and therefore the costs remaining fixed for the lifetime. What you're seeing at the bottom line, the blue line for the bundled PPA, is a reflection of the fact that we are assuming within this analysis that energy prices rise over the lifetime of the projection. So as energy prices rise, but our bundled PPA payment as a total payment is fixed, that means that the net payment, the net incentive we're paying to generators goes down. And accordingly, you see the blue line coming down. Then the orange line in the middle reflects a base case scenario which shows a mix of REC and bundled PPAs. And then on the right-hand side in the graph, you're seeing, not surprisingly, that after taking account of the carbon benefits, those cost lines come down and actually turn into net benefits. Then finally, how does that all add up to, as I said, an intuitive number? So at the top, you see the bill impacts number that's shown as a percentage of tier 1 costs as a percentage of energy bills. And again, not surprisingly, given what I've just said, you can see there that the PPA scenario shows a significantly lower cost than the REC scenario. Moving on to our next driving factor of costs, energy prices. Here we are seeing the energy price forecasts we are using for our analysis, both as central high and low cases. I won't go into the detail on the assumptions behind those. We will hear a bit more about those in the presentation on methodology later this morning. So this takes us to a similar graph to the one that we looked at just now, and now we're looking at the impact of energy prices as a driver on those costs. So again, as I just mentioned, we have a base case and a high and a low energy price assumption. If energy prices are high, and that's shown here as the blue line at the bottom, then you're seeing that our effective tier 1 costs are lower. And again, this matches what I said earlier. If we are paying generators a certain amount needed for projects to be profitable, then if they get more of that revenue from energy prices, because energy prices are high, then the effective incentive payment turns out to be lower. And so we're seeing that for the high energy price scenario as a lower line on these graphs. And conversely, if energy prices are lower, then the cost of tier 1 would be higher. And as you can see in the bill impact percentages, the impact of energy prices is quite significant on the bill impact percentage. However, I wouldn't want you to take the message away from that therefore high energy prices are good and low energy prices are bad. So there is a bit more to be said about that. On this graph, I'm starting off by showing you historic wholesale energy prices. As you know, much higher than they are currently. And what I would like to take you through now is a comparison of those energy prices in our forecast against the additional cost of the Clean Energy Standard. And what you're seeing here is our base case to 2023, but that's not really very easy to look at. So again, I'm going to open it up to the 2030 time horizon, and indeed the full modeling time horizon, not just 2030, but all the way to 2049, which is when, again, if you take account of a 20-year lifetime, installations installed in 2030 would make it through to 2049. So in the base case shown here, you see the base case energy projection, and that's the orange line showing the incremental cost of the Clean Energy Standard. To note here, we don't actually have a forecast of retail energy prices. We have a forecast of wholesale energy prices. So that's shown here. So proportionately, if we're talking about actually the impact of the Clean Energy Standard on customers' energy bills, proportionally the increase you're seeing here is too high because it's an increase shown against wholesale energy prices. But the point I'm trying to make still stands. So if we now take a look at the high energy price scenario, as I said, that means Clean Energy Standard costs would be lower. And so you can even see here as the gray line that at some point they dip below the energy price forecast, showing that customers start to see lower energy bills because of the increase in renewables. And then finally, if we look at the low energy price scenario, then yes, the costs of the clean energy standard are higher, but the important point, customers are still paying less than in any of the other scenarios. The next of the cost drivers, we examined interest rates. I'll be very brief about this one. We looked at the impact of higher interest rates, which would lead to higher costs of debt for renewable energy projects, but the relative impact of this cost driver turned out to be less than the cost drivers we've already looked at. So I will skip over this one and keep going. The next one is a question: what happens if technology costs turn out differently from what we're assuming in our base case? Remember, to 2023, we're seeing as the main large-scale renewables technology being deployed land-based wind. So we applied a cost sensitivity on land-based wind. And as a result, shown here on the right-hand side, if we assume higher costs for land-based wind, then we're seeing some of that land-based wind crowded out by more solar PV. But again, that's a fairly limited story, so I'm opening it up to the 2030 time horizon. I'm sure you will start asking when the exception starts becoming the rule. But so again, a quick peek at the 2030 numbers in this case. Remember, for 2030, we saw a wider portfolio of technologies. So for our analysis of variations of technology costs, we also looked at how each of those technology costs could differ in their cost level. That's shown on this slide. On the left-hand side, you're seeing the base case, where by 2030, as we saw earlier, we see a mix of land-based wind, solar PV, imports, offshore wind, and a couple of other technologies. If we now tweak each of those main technologies, we've already talked about higher land-based wind. That's the second column shown here. Then you predominantly get to see more solar PV. If conversely we assume higher costs for utility-scale solar PV, then we see a bit more land-based wind and a bit more from the other technologies as well. And finally, if we assume higher costs for offshore wind, then offshore wind disappears almost entirely from the picture. However, the main point to get across is that I want to get across here is not so much about the mix of technologies, but rather the overall impact on cost. And Carl has already made the point, so I'll just repeat it. The interesting point here is that even though we are tweaking some of those technology cost assumptions, the overall bottom line costs shown on this slide are still fairly similar. The deviation isn't too great. Remember, in all of those cost sensitivities, we're assuming an increase of a particular technology cost, so it's not surprising that in all of the sensitivities we see an increase in total cost. The base case cost number shown here is almost 1%, and actually I should interrupt myself here to remind you that these bill impact percentages are not to be compared with the ones we looked at earlier. The ones we looked at earlier were for Tier 1 over the 2023 time horizon. Remember, we're now making a detour into the 2030 time horizon, and the percentages you're looking at here are for 2030 and for the total CES rather than just Tier 1. So just as a flag in terms of the numbers you're looking at. So for the base case, we're looking at almost 1%. And if we tweak each of those technologies, land-based wind, PV, and offshore wind, in each case, as expected, it increases the cost, but not by a great amount. So that's the interesting point. If one technology performs less, if you will, than expected, it looks like other technologies are able to pitch in, and we're looking at a portfolio of technologies with converging technology costs, which gives us a higher degree of confidence that we actually have a portfolio of technologies that can deliver the clean energy standard. The next cost driver we examined was system load, by which we mean the amount of electricity consumed across the system, and therefore the amount of renewable electricity that's needed to achieve a 50% target. We examined an assumption of a higher system load compared to the base case, and therefore a higher amount of renewable electricity needed to get to the target. What you're looking at here is what technology mix would deliver that higher load assumption, and compared to the baseline on the left. You're seeing, again, an increase in most of the other technologies, and indeed land-based wind itself increases as well, as does solar PV, and in particular a higher level of imports. If we now look at what that means for overall costs, then it's not a great surprise. If we need to deliver more renewables, then the costs are going to be higher. The gross program costs shown on the left as the grey line above the orange base case line. However, more renewables also means more carbon benefits. So if you look at the right-hand side, then our overall net benefit after taking account of carbon benefits increases in the high system load scenario. One more, federal tax credits. The point here is really a very limited one, which is that for us, federal tax credits are good. They reduce our costs, and so if we didn't have federal tax credits, then not surprisingly, we would see higher costs in the system. And if federal tax credits remained in place at their current level, then we would see lower costs. So that's it for Tier 1. A couple of quick points about Tier 2. We took a similar approach to Tier 2A in our analysis as to Tier 1, i.e. again we wanted to look at the impact of cost drivers. The main cost drivers that need to be examined here are the procurement structures and energy prices. Some of the other cost drivers are simply not relevant. Remember, Tier 2A is for existing renewables, so it doesn't really matter what federal tax credits do because we're not building new renewables under Tier 2A. So if we're looking at procurement structures, and I can be brief both on this slide and the next one about energy prices because the story is quite a similar one. On the procurement structures for Tier 2A, there's one slight difference, which is that in our analysis we compared a scenario for spot prices rather than fixed rate prices. Remember, in Tier 2A, we're trying to figure out what we would pay for Tier 2A to ensure that those renewables stay here rather than exporting to other territories. So the spot price assumption is analytically a method to forecast what the spot prices would be in neighboring territories and therefore what spot price payment we would make here to match that. Conversely, we could also envisage PPA structures for Tier 2A where renewable generators get offered a fixed PPA contract to stay here in New York State. That would, again, as in Tier 1, give them a higher revenue certainty compared to spot prices elsewhere. So the analytical conclusion there is that we could offer those PPAs at a lower price than the likely spot price because that higher revenue certainty would make up for the potential, put differently, that higher certainty would reduce project risks. So similarly, therefore, what you're seeing here is not surprising that the blue line shown at the bottom shows lower costs than the grey line showing the spot price assumption. Energy prices then, again, it's the same story, though, as I said earlier, I don't want you to take the message away that high energy prices are good and low energy prices are bad, but for the Clean Energy Standard cost, that is the conclusion. And finally, I'm ending on perhaps not my most exciting slide. I cue any number of jokes about flatlining, but Tier 2B, the analytical approach there has been to look at other territories and assess what levels of payments have been made to similar renewables in other territories, and we took a high and low case for those payment levels. The quantity of Tier 2B renewables doesn't change, so with a fixed payment amount and a fixed quantity, you end up with a flat level of costs. So that's it from me, and at this point I'll hand over to Jeff to take us through Tier 3.
Thank you, Eric. My name is Jeff Hogan. I'm a chief with the Department of Public Service and the Office of Accounting, Audits, and Finance. As most of you are aware, the governor's letter, which instructed the Department of Public Service to create and develop the Clean Energy Standard regarding renewable energy, also stressed the importance of emission-free sources such as the upstate nuclear plants. As the letter pointed out, if the upstate nuclear plants were to close, the level of emissions in New York would increase dramatically. The Brattle Group estimates that if the upstate nuclear plants were to close, that there would be an impact of nearly 16 million tons of additional CO2 released each year. The governor's letter also pointed out that due to the plant's closing, there would be a decrease of fuel diversity, there would be more price volatility for electricity, and there would also be significant negative economic impacts, obviously, on the host communities of these plants. While the staff white paper on the Clean Energy Standard laid out a proposal to allow the nuclear plants to remain operational, it must be remembered that the Tier 3 effort is completely separate from the renewable energy effort of Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 3 doesn't impact the glide path that's being discussed for Tiers 1 and 2. It also doesn't impact the overall cost that customers would incur for Tiers 1 and 2. Tier 3 is essentially a bridge to a time when a much higher level of renewables is meeting New York's energy needs as to compose the current situation. When renewable energy's zero emission generation makes up a much larger portion of the fuel mix, for instance, in 2030 when we get to 50%, the need to ensure that the nuclear plants are operational and that we have that carbon-free benefit will be less. So it's, again, just a bridge to get to this 2030 endpoint. In order to estimate the total cost of Tier 3, we must have an estimate of both the number of zero-emission credits, or ZECs, that will be purchased, as well as the cost per year of purchasing a ZEC. Regarding the quantity of ZECs, the Clean Energy Standard staff white paper proposed a phase-in approach where there would be 10,000 gigawatt hours per year in the initial 2 years of output from qualified nuclear facilities who are receiving support. Since the white paper proposed that the mandate begin for ZECs on April 1st, 2017, the calendar year 2017 had 3/4 of a year, or 7,500 gigawatt hours. That's the target that was in the white paper. The white paper then proposed that in 2019, that level would increase to 15,000 gigawatts, and the following year and on through the rest of the program, it would be at 25,000 gigawatt hours, which is nearly all of the generation from upstate New York nuclear plants on average over the past 10 years. So while the approach to the quantity of ZECs outlined in the white paper is one which was modeled in the cost study, there are other possible approaches that could be considered. For instance, some parties have suggested that all qualified facilities could declare their level of available ZECs, and to avoid steep bill impacts, the amount paid could be budget bounded and increase over time and step in the economic impact on customers. The next step in determining the cost of Tier 3 is to figure out how much each ZEC will cost. However, while the cost of Tier 1 and 2 RECs can be estimated based on the technology used, projected installation costs of those technologies, assuming developer competition that would keep the developers, keep the cost accurate, or keep the cost economical, there's a limited number of ZEC sellers, and that raises market power concerns. Therefore, the staff white paper called for an alternative compliance payment, or ACP, to be administratively determined based on a review of the expected costs of the facilities, as well as the projected energy and capacity revenues that the facilities can expect. This ACP will act as a cap on the amount of that the load-serving entities, or LSEs, will have to pay per ZEC, and should limit the amount that the qualifying facilities receive only to the shortfall between their expected revenue level and their actual cost. For the costs of the prospective sellers of ZECs, confidential data will have to be filed for each plant. The exact cost categories, which will be included, will also be open to discussion. For instance, shared overhead expenses, recovery of past investments, risk adders that might be added to the to-go costs, are all things I'm sure are going to be debated during the process of coming up with the costs for each plant. For the Clean Energy Cost Study, staff made an estimate of cost based on data from the Gunay RSSA proceeding. This was the only public New York nuclear cost data which staff had access to. However, that level of cost isn't likely to be indicative of the total upstate nuclear plant costs. Larger multi-unit sites, such as 9 Mile, where cost per megawatt hour would undoubtedly be lower, should lead to lower average costs. In fact, in its comments, Exelon estimated its upstate New York fleet's cost per megawatt hour to be approximately $50. And they estimate that that's lower than what staff had used in its analysis. In addition to the cost estimates, a level of projected revenues will also be needed. While the cost study has 3 energy price forecasts, as Eric was stating, those will be stale by the time we set an ACP. So staff anticipates that as the ZEC ACP will have to be set using a relatively short-term forecast of revenues made close to the time the ACP is being set, and preferably with publicly available data so that everyone knew where this was coming from and could agree on the revenues, on the expected revenues for the plant. As the Clean Energy Standard cost study stated, the disclosure of staff's estimates in detail could prejudice the review of the qualifying facilities costs down the road, but some broad estimates have been provided. Looking at costs through 2023 for a range of cost estimates and energy prices, the cost study developed a range of Tier 3 program costs of $59 million to $658 million, excluding any benefit related to carbon emissions. When the extremely large carbon benefit that occurs due to the nuclear plants staying open is included in the cost analysis, there's a large net program cost benefit. However, as I stated, these numbers really must be considered illustrative, as actual plant costs have not yet been reviewed and revenue forecasts are still to be developed. Also, the final determination of the method of coming up with a quantity of ZECs is something that has to be decided. Finally, I want to address the expected cost of Tier 3 post-2023. The cost study actually has a table which shows that the same gross program costs for Tier 3 in 2023 the program costs of 2023 are the same as through 2030. And this is because, as Eric showed in slide number 15 today, that in 2023, the expected energy revenue is expected to be nearly $60 per megawatt hour. Given nuclear plant costs in the $50 neighborhood today, increasing for inflation, hopefully some productivity, decreasing that over time, it's expected that using the base case revenue forecast, that revenue will exceed the cost of the nuclear plants by 2023. In other words, all the costs for Tier 3 are expected to be incurred over the first half of the Clean Energy Standard time period. And while the ongoing cost is expected to be zero, the carbon benefits of having kept the nuclear plants open will continue to accrue for New York customers. I'd now like to turn the presentation back over to Eric.
Well, and I'm going to immediately turn it back over to our next speaker, who's Bob Grace from Sustainable Energy Advantage, and will take us through the methodology used for coming up with the results that we've heard about today.
Excellent. Hello, my name's Bob Grace. I'm from Sustainable Energy Advantage. We've been working as a consultant through NYSERDA on this project, and I've had the pleasure and challenge of heading up the analytical efforts on the cost study
All pleasure.
For the Tier 1 and Tier 2 costs. As for those of you who've reviewed the full cost study supplement, it's a very complex analysis that has a lot of moving parts. Given our limited time today here, I will touch on some of the highlights, but certainly happy to and welcome questions later on in the Q&A on all of the points, whether I've covered them here right now or not. So the most important thing here is the structure of the modeling, and it is at its heart a basic microeconomics 101 supply curve analysis. The supply curve for potential future renewables consists of costs, the quantities of potentially available renewables, of newly constructed renewables available to meet the annual incremental demand in New York under long-term contracts that are either coming from a fixed price REC only contract or a bundled PPA here analyzes fixed payments for RECs, energy, and capacity. The whole analysis is built on distilling all of this information into blocks of supply. So those are blocks of supply sources that are sorted from low to high premium, and that premium is really the difference between the levelized cost of energy and the levelized projected commodity market value. The results then are derived as either all fixed price RECs or all bundled PPAs, and then a mix between the two is derived by averaging or blending the results. You can see here on the right that our team involved our own folks at Sustainable Energy Advantage, as well as some other folks on the team who are particular experts in their field, AWS True Power in wind, and Terry's group on biomass, Daymark Energy Advisors on some of the wholesale power and imports issues. So taking a 50,000-foot level view of the structure of the model, there are a lot of flows of information that flow together here, and I'm just going to take you on a little flyover here. We start...
Bob, let me interrupt for one second. Just let everybody know that we will be posting the slides on DMM, so they will be available after the conference. So you needn't try and sketch it out as Bob talks.
You'd have to be doing a lot of sketching. So here we start by assembling all of the cost elements. What do the different renewable technologies cost, taking into account their capital costs, their operation and maintenance, their interconnection, and integration costs, the cost of financing, whatever incentives are available to those resources. We assemble these into forecasts of the renewable levelized cost of energy for supply within each New York ISO zone. And then we compare those to the market commodity revenues, which vary by zone. Downstate generation worth more than upstate, for example, taking into account the energy and the capacity revenue. And then we compare them and look at the differential. So that's that differential, that premium that's based and that drives the sorting from low to high. So then we effectively from there create our supply curve, which is renewable generation premium by resource by block. From there, we have our supply curve, and this represents incremental supply between 2017 and 2030. The next important thing is to consider what's the demand. So here we look at the incremental demand. Each year there'll be a new tranche of demand to be met by supply, and we take that through what we call a block clearing analysis. So this is where we simply align supply and demand and identify what we expect to be deployed. In doing that, we can calculate the cost or the premium in two different ways. We can look at a clearing price, what's the highest cost block that cleared the market. We can also look at the cost of all the individual blocks that were called upon or deployed in that year. So that's more like an as-bid type of a auction structure. And ultimately, we reflected and used in this analysis a hybrid that considered both, which we consider to be reflective of a market which does have a competitive but as-bid nature, but also has a lot of market information, and where the low-cost bidders sometimes can bid above their threshold. So this is similar to, indicative of, the current main tier RPS structure. From there, we effectively assess what the payments are and what we expect to be deployed, and those can be rolled up into the policy cost. So everybody gets it now, right? We don't need to go through the rest. Some of the key parameters in this analysis are the resource types that are characterized, and those are those that are expected to meet the RPS main tier eligibility criteria. That was a fundamental assumption here. As well as those that are most likely to contribute. So we focused on the big players, land-based wind, offshore wind, utility-scale solar, small hydro, and biomass. There are other types of renewables that could or would be eligible, but ultimately their contribution was expected to be small and not move the needle very much. In terms of geography, we assumed that what was eligible is going to be generation both within New York as well as imports from adjacent control areas into New York as long as they had energy deliverability and they didn't commit their capacity in other markets. So in that way, the analysis considers PJM, and we looked at wind resources in PJM as the most likely to be exported. We looked at Ontario, where we looked at wind and the small hydro that would be meet these eligibility criteria. We looked at Quebec, wind in Quebec, all of which could be deliverable to New York ISO. We ignored New England as a potential net exporter to New York, given that we expect the flow to be more likely, as it has in the past, to go in the other direction, if at all. We also looked at the temporal analysis. We looked at each project, assuming to be contracted for 20 years. The analysis horizon, as Eric had suggested earlier, looked at deployment of projects between 2017 and 2030, and that the policy payments reflected those deployed over that period of time, continuing through the life of their contracts. We considered that there are different lags between contracting and commercial operation for different technologies. This is something that's important and relevant for two perspectives. It's what incentives are available, especially as the incentives phase out, and when would the supply be procured relative to when it would come online. So some of the key characteristics of the resource blocks include the location. So what New York ISO zone was it in, and that tells you what revenues it's eligible for. What's the developable quantity in megawatts? How much supply from each of these resources is likely to be available? How much energy can a megawatt produce? What's its capacity factor? What's the typical scale of a resource? While you can have wind projects or solar projects at a number of scales, we selected certain typical scales for developing economic analysis. What are the capital expenditures, including transmission and connection, necessary to bring those into commercial operation? What are the cost of network upgrades that might be necessary to integrate those into the grid? What are the fixed or variable operation and maintenance costs necessary to operate those over time? What's the production profile going to be? Something that produces more on-peak than off-peak is going to have a greater market value than something that might have a different production profile. What's the cost of financing, the structure of financing? These are things that we reflected in a carrying charge that represented all of those structures. What incentives are available to the generators? And finally, for biomass, what are the operating characteristics, the heat rate, and the fuel costs available? So we put all of that together into getting to a levelized cost of energy, which has a number of different components to it. We take all of those factors that I just described, and effectively they roll up into a commonly used metric called the levelized cost of energy, which is measured in dollars per megawatt hour. That's a very useful metric for comparing project revenue requirements with the value of the electricity produced by those generators. And it's very similar to and can be thought of as analogous to a long-term bundled PPA price, power purchase agreement price, over the economic life of the project. It doesn't directly take into account the differential value. That's something that happens at the next step. In considering the upfront capital costs, we take into account the total capital expenditures to reach commercial operation, and those include installed costs, interconnection costs, labor reserves, and financing-related costs. The operation and maintenance cost include a number of different things: cost and labor and parts, insurance, land costs like lease and royalties, management administrative costs, taxes or payments in lieu of tax, that's property taxes, and capital replacements and overhauls are all rolled in there. And finally, the cost of capital, capital structure, and financing requirements, which take into account the debt and equity structure, the debt term, the cost of debt, the cost of equity or the hurdle rate for equity investors, things like income tax and depreciation and system life. There are a few other demands that we consider besides the demand driven by the Tier 1 Clean Energy Standard. We expect there to be some degree of a voluntary market for these same types of supply sources in New York, and we assumed that the Tier 1 would have to compete head-to-head with that voluntary market, so that there would be a little additional demand considered in how much need to be met. But in terms of the cost of the CES, we only took into account that amount procured to meet the CES targets. And as far as neighboring markets, we could have considered that New York supply would be used to supply demands for renewable portfolio standards in some of the surrounding markets. This was not modeled explicitly. We've assumed that the Tier 1 mechanism would encourage, if anything, import into New York rather than, as has been the historical and maybe current practice, export from New York to some of the neighbors. As can be seen in the graph up here on the right, we assumed a penetration of the voluntary demand reaching about 1% of load over time. So as Eric and Carl had mentioned earlier, the net program costs that were shown reflect a carbon value in addition to the direct costs. Shown here in this graph are the total height of the bar represents the total social cost of carbon that's based on EPA's July 2015 projections. And you can see here the orange part of the bar is effectively the carbon value that is cooked into the energy price forecast. Those costs are already taken into account in the market value. And so it's the remainder that represents the incremental social cost of carbon. All right, so let's talk about the energy and capacity market values. So these were introduced at a high level earlier on. Let me explain a little bit about where these numbers came from and how they were derived. Starting with the energy, there are forecasts for each one of the New York ISO zones. So as you might expect, energy value and energy revenues are worth more downstate than upstate, for example. In the near term, between the present and 2024, this information came from a downward adjustment to the 2015 NYISO-CARIS forecast, since energy prices had dropped significantly since that forecast had been issued. The department had made an adjustment downward to try to align those costs with current experience at the time of this analysis. Thereafter, from 2025 and thereafter, we extended these forecasts based on two perspectives, really a weighted average of two perspectives. One perspective was the effectively extending these at a constant and real dollar term, and the other was effectively trending them at the long-term EIA reference case natural gas prices. Natural gas prices have been perhaps the predominant long-term trend driver. And so we developed a blend over time that represented the influence of either of these to extrapolate those. One of the implications of these of this approach is that the avoided cost of carbon policy compliance is embedded in the New York ISO-CARIS energy price forecast, so the first period of time through 2024. Thereafter, this methodology implicitly increases the carbon value at the rate of change of the energy price forecast thereafter. As far as capacity goes, before we get to capacity, so the alternative energy market price forecast, you've seen the results of high and low energy price analyses here. Effectively, we took a 115% of the base case to represent the high case and a 90% to represent the low case. Capacity prices were also derived in a two-stage manner. Different prices, upstate and downstate. Again, that's pretty intuitive. From the period 2015 to 2035, the UCAP prices were based on the Commission's benefit cost analysis framework. Thereafter, the numbers were held constant in real terms. These were adjusted based on weighted summer and winter averages, and then applied on a technology-specific basis later to reflect each technology's ability to capture those capacity revenues. That's great. So next, I'll turn to financing. Given that most of the renewables are very capital intensive, most of the costs are upfront, the financing costs are a rather important driver. And the financing assumption framework basically focused on the differing risk exposure under different contracting and incentive regimes. And those differences in risks are embedded entirely in the differences in the cost of capital. So effectively, the unhedged revenue streams in a PPA-only environment are not discounted to reflect the risk of being able to capture those revenue streams. All of the differential in that risk is embedded in the assumed cost of capital. And these financing assumptions were ultimately calibrated with available data from recent purchase power agreements in the region, as well as from the recent main tier RPS solicitations. So that helps us ground them in reality. The financing assumptions, you can see here on the left, reflect the 20-year contract duration and federal and New York tax rates. You can see on the lower left the different percent debt by technology and size. The key point here is whatever, or a few key points, whatever isn't supplied by debt is made up by equity contributions. And under different, 4 different types of scenarios, either REC only or bundled PPA, and either with federal tax incentives or without, we developed 4 different sets of debt equity splits that were representative of those capital structures prevalent in the marketplace. The debt term, shown in the upper right, varies by technology, and this again is typical of what you see in the marketplace, and in particular biomass and biomass repowering tend to have shorter debt terms because they have a lot more fuel price risk exposure. The cost of debt and equity is shown in the next couple of graphs. So here in the lower left, again hard to see, but you'll be able to see these at your leisure. The cost of equity, again, varies by both technology and size, as well as by the incentive and contracting regime. So in general, the cost of capital is higher when there's more risk, and it is also different when there are tax incentives involved. Some of the key points here. There's a size sensitivity, so large-scale wind, for example, has access to lower cost of capital than smaller installations. Looking at the upper right, the cost of debt also varies by technology and size, and this is a little bit hard to see, but there are 2 colors here. There's a base case and the assumptions that we used for the high debt case. Focusing first on the base case, we assumed effectively a 6% cost of debt for utility-scale solar, land-based wind, somewhat higher for the other technologies. And the high cost sensitivity basically added 0.25% to the cost of debt there. An important frame on these numbers is that this is an assumption that's applied through the analysis all the way through deployment through 2030. We're coming out of a period of historically low cost of capital, very cheap debt. What you could finance one of these projects for last year or today is probably lower than this. This is meant to reflect a somewhat of a drifting back to a land of greater normalcy on the cost of debt. Offshore wind was dealt with a little bit differently because of the maturity of the marketplace, or today's lack of that maturity. One thing that was left off of this, I'll just mention here, is the cost of debt. We assumed a 6.5% cost of debt compared to the 6% that was used in the land-based wind. But here we focus on some of the differences in the expected capital structure and cost over time. So the finance risks and hence the internal rate of return is expected to decrease over time as the market matures. Today is an increased, today with an extremely immature market, there are a lot of potential risk exposures that as the market matures, gets experience, gets to scale, and industrializes would be expected to be squeezed out, potentially rapidly squeezed out of the marketplace. So what we did was, in terms of the equity cost was established assumptions for 3 maturity phases, what we have today, what we have in a midpoint, what we have in an endpoint, and that would be declining over time. At the endpoint, we expect it to more or less align with the fully mature market, like today's land-based wind cost of equity. So that would be equivalent to our assumptions for land-based wind, except for some modest construction period and performance risk differential that will always be the difference between a wind turbine built on land versus one far out to sea. So under the bundled PPA structure, we reduced our internal rate of return from 11% to 9% in these 3 steps, and under the fixed price REC from 12.75% down to 10.75%. Down at the bottom, you can also see the percent debt assumptions that were applied in the different combinations of federal incentive and contracting scenarios. So next I'll turn to the federal tax incentives. During the course of this analysis, Congress went ahead and made some changes and extended both the federal production tax credit and investment tax credit, but also phased them down and out. So on the left side here, you can see the federal production tax credit schedule as a percent of the full credit value. And so you can see by 2020, that's fully phased out. This was compared on the right-hand side to the investment tax credit schedule. This is what's available to utility scale solar or PV. So that's the level, or the gray line that levels out at 10%. And then the ITC, which would be soon to be taken in lieu of PTC by offshore wind, which matches the graph on the left. The importance of timing here is, with this phase out, is that a project that effectively commences construction, meeting IRS definitions for what that means, at a certain time will qualify for the incentives available at that time. So, for example, in 2018, the PTC value would be 60% of its full value. If you start construction at that period of time, you'll get to carry that incentive value forward a couple of years into the future, and so we've accommodated for that lag in our analysis. One other fact, and this is an important one, with the extension of the federal tax credits, tax equity has been scarce in the marketplace. It's something that there are a limited number of suppliers that have the right kind of tax structure and appetite to be able to fully take credit for the tax credits. With the extensions, we expect that to be increasingly scarce, and we have assumed that investors would not be able to fully monetize the value of the tax credits. And so we've effectively built in a little bit of a haircut to how much of that investment tax credit and production tax credit could be monetized, and they vary a little bit by the type of technology, the different investment pipelines have a different degree of maturity and ability to take care of to take advantage of these tax credits. So next we will turn to transmission and interconnection, an important component of the capital cost. And we looked at 2 different dimensions here. One we'll refer to as the extension cord cost. So this is what does it cost to have a generator lead from the location of the generator to physically interconnect to the system. So this takes into account the capital expenditures necessary to do a generator lead line of the appropriate voltage and the length of its line, which was 130% of the straight line distance between that generator and its interconnection point, and also the non-line costs of interconnecting. So do you need to upgrade an existing substation? Would you build a new substation and associated breakers and other equipment? And effectively in our analysis, we did an optimization analysis. So for any particular resource location, we looked at all the potential locations that it could interconnect to and the cost of doing each of those, and selected a least cost approach. Oops. How do I go back here? That one? Okay. So the other component of transmission interconnection is the network upgrade cost. So this is what has to happen upstream of that point of interconnection to allow the deliverability of that supply. And generally, developers today face non-reimbursed costs that are charged by the ISO or the interconnecting utility through the interconnection process. So for purposes of this analysis, these costs tend to vary significantly by location, by time. They're very nonlinear. We estimated broadly and generically a level to capture a reasonably appropriate magnitude of these expected costs across the whole supply curve. There is additional work going on outside the scope of this analysis in the State Resource Plan that's going to add more information and precision and look at these types of costs under bigger, sharper microscope. So shifting to Tier 2. So Tier 1 was a supply curve analysis. What matters is the cost of new supply. Tier 2 is based on existing supply. So the cost of financing, the cost of the generation no longer matters. All of this generation is already operating. The underlying approach to thinking about Tier 2 was opportunity cost. These are generators that have owners that are looking to maximize their revenues. What are they going to do so? And if New York wants to keep this supply in state, counting towards meeting the Clean Energy Standard, what type of revenues would New York have to make available in order to keep that supply in place? So Tier 2A basically took the approach. So by definition, these are resources that are new post-restructuring, but have material revenue opportunities in surrounding markets. A lot of this existing supply that isn't currently contracted in NYSERDA is already being exported to New England and has been taking advantage of New England Class 1 REC prices if the energy is delivered to New England. In the future, it's possible that PJM Tier 1 prices and markets could be more competitive or attractive, but for now we've assumed that New England was the driving market. And so the objective here was for New York to retain this energy, to be able to have the greenhouse gas impact of having that generation in New York, and have the RECs to count towards the CES target through 2030. The targets that were established were based on the assumption that large hydro was not eligible, that initially the targets were set based on the contribution of this fleet of resources to New York's mix in 2014, so net of what was already being exported. And the targets would increase over time as the existing main tier contracts, RPS contracts, came to an end. So that supply is effectively what New York would be competing to retain. So the question that was answered here, or that we sought to answer, was what revenues would successfully attract such resources to sell their RECs in New York rather than exporting them to other markets. And the cost estimates were based on an assessment of the generator's opportunity cost as well as their risks and the risks associated with each of those revenue streams. So we looked at this from a spot and a bundled perspective, like in Tier 1. The spot assumed that there would not be long-term contracts, that we would be comparing the spot value available in New York compared to the spot value available in New England. So the analysis is based on the New York market providing a similar or slightly lower level of revenue risk as spot prices available in alternative markets. We assumed that there would be an alternative compliance payment or price cap in the Class 2A marketplace that was set at a level to approximate that break-even price. When we considered the PPA perspective, we looked at the ability for a New York project to have a hedged REC and energy and capacity revenue stream. So it's based on the New York bundled PPA revenue stream, providing the necessary incentive for generation to stay in New York, compared to a varying stream of REC and energy revenues in New England, and also considering both the cost of moving the power from New York to New England and the risks associated with them. And here, critically, we assume that the duration of the contract was one from whatever the year in question was through 2030. We didn't look beyond 2030. These are projects that are getting progressively older. We didn't assume that they would have 40 or 50-year lives, but that rather they would be contracted for the diminishing remainder of their life. And the risks and rewards differ, and we had expected revenue streams valued differently. Tier 2B was not a analysis per se at all. This was approached rather differently. These, by definition, are generators that are not eligible elsewhere for RPS revenues that are material, and so generally these are resources that they're eligible for what they're already eligible. They haven't been getting exported. New York can't count their RECs if they don't have them. The generators own those RECs. So this is generally older renewable generators with limited revenue alternatives, and our objective here was to retain them. The targets were set based on the quantity of this supply in the 2014 baseline that's not already, the RECs that are not only owned by New York State, net of the expired RPS main tier contracts, and ultimately in asking the question what revenues would successfully cause resources to sell their RECs in New York, we looked around at the prevailing market prices of these existing renewables or Tier 2, Class 2 type of markets in surrounding markets, and just assumed that New York's marketplace would look fairly similar. And we had a range of assumptions that reflected that. So I think that's where we leave off until the next session, and I'll turn this over to
Thank you.
to Scott.
Thank you. For those of you keeping score, you'll note that we are materially ahead of schedule. Thank you, everybody. So my confession is that over the past 2 days, I kept whining about the number of slides and my fear that we would run over time, and also that we might bore you all to death with the presentation. Certainly, I was wrong on the first. I don't know about the second. I want to make a suggestion on how we proceed, but first I want to acknowledge John Rhodes, who joined us. I think John is still in the room. John, thank you. I think everybody knows that John is the president of NYSERDA, and on behalf of my colleagues at DPS, and also I know the commissioners, Audrey and her colleagues, John, I want to thank you and your colleagues for the support that you've provided throughout the development of the CES white paper, and of course this cost study. So thank you for joining us. We have about an extra 20 minutes on the schedule, and my thought is I had thought about possibly going to the afternoon session, but I'm not sure about how much time is going to be taken on questions and answers from this morning's presentation. So I'd like to go into that now, and let's see how much time is taken up. If there's still some excess time, then Bob, I may call upon you to begin the technology-specific presentation. That'll give us a little more room in the afternoon, or we can use the available time this morning for questions and answers. We do have some questions that have come in through the web. Thank you very much. And I want to just ask those of you, whether remote or here in the room, that if you're going to ask a question at this time, that you please ask a question. We want to use the time available today to increase your understanding and your access to the information contained in the cost study, its methodology, all to the end of informing any comments you may want to file. And let's use the comment filing as a time to offer opinions and comments. So that said, as I said, we're going to have a very informal process. If you're interested in asking a question, I'll ask you to come up to the podium. We've got a couple questions that have been sent in via email, so we can start with those while those of you who may want to can formulate questions. And in order to start this off, I'd pass one off to Carl, so I will ask you to take that.
Sure. So we have a question in that came to us via email. It actually refers to slide 107 in the full cost study and focuses on wholesale price impacts. So this is a multi-part question. I'll just read it as written and then I can address them. So it quotes slide 07 and says, what does, quote, "It is appropriate to acknowledge that such price reductions will temporarily reduce or eliminate these impacts" mean? And for more context, slide 107 speaks to the potential impacts of wholesale price impacts, and it was referring to how it's not included in a societal cost test. It would be included in a rate impact test. Further follow-on questions: how exactly are wholesale market price reductions resulting from the CES reflected in the cost study's assessment of cost benefits? Next part is, what level of wholesale price reductions in dollars per megawatt hour of energy and dollars per kilowatt per month of capacity does the cost study assume? And finally, do the retail bill impact analysis that reflect wholesale price reductions resulting from the CES? So as we acknowledged on 107, wholesale price impacts are real. The quantification of those can be challenging. They are not included in a traditional societal cost test. They would be in a rate impact test. So the short answer is we did not include any wholesale price impacts in our societal test, which was the focus of those first slides that I addressed. So that 1.8 billion of net benefit does not include any wholesale impacts. And we did not explicitly include any wholesale, we did not include any wholesale price reductions and the impacts of those on rate impacts. So those rate impact percentages do not include any wholesale price reductions.
Thank you. And could I ask that everybody just identify both your name and the organization you represent?
Good morning. My name is Christopher Raup. I work for Con Edison. I had a few questions. I think they're quick, so I'll try to ask them all. But if they go long,
You'll get the hook.
I'll get the hook. Thank you. So, the first one has to do with the assumptions about wholesale energy prices rising over time. So that seems like an important assumption, and I'm curious if you did any sensitivities under a case where wholesale energy prices kind of stayed flat. Which seems to me a possibility if, for example, we add 25% more resources to the system that have zero marginal costs. That could have a big impact on wholesale energy prices. So that was kind of part A of that one. So then the other part of that is if you did do that kind of sensitivity, how would that impact the finding that PPAs are a much less cost way to go than a NYSERDA REC type market?
Okay, so I'll take that to start, and then Bob, maybe I can hand it off to you as well. So we did look at wholesale price sensitivities. As we mentioned, our base case was reflective of the KERS process, and then we had to go beyond that in years. So we looked at the EIA's natural gas price forecast. So that was what we felt, was the best publicly available information that we could reference. We'd love to see as part of the comment process, if you have any alternative data that you can submit and put on the record, we'd love to be able to compare against that. We did do a low price sensitivity. I don't think it's quite flat. All our graphs were in nominal dollars, so inflation is also built in, so they'll have a slope. It wasn't quite flat in real terms, but it was a significantly lower price. And even in that case, we did show that there was a net benefit. In terms of the interaction with the PPAs, I don't know if Bob, if you want to talk a little bit about your instinct there.
Sure. So in general, if we took a flatter or a lower cost estimate, we would expect that the costs under a REC only and under a PPA would both be higher, directionally similar to what we've seen here. But we expect that there would always be a risk differential. The prices that a generator would offer into a REC only procurement are going to be based on their expectations of the energy and capacity prices that they can't hedge. If we're in a world where they're flatter, their bids are going to be higher as well. So there are the bids are always going to be a function of what a generator is expecting in their hedged and unhedged revenue streams and the existence of a higher risk in unhedged revenue streams, whatever they are, and particular if the world is looking bleak and low cost, then those generators are going to need to get all the more revenue in the REC contract. So we would certainly not expect those lines to ever cross.
Okay. My second question had to do with the assumptions about what types of resources are built, and I was wondering if you did any analysis of where resources would come into existence, in state versus out of state, for example, during the. Yep.
Sure. And so we did an analysis that had a lot of geospatial characteristics to it. My discussion this afternoon will touch on a number of those assumptions, and I think there are. I wonder whether actually it would make sense to come back to that after we talk about the resource-specific assumptions.
Sense. Okay.
And Chris, also, we did include imports, so
Right.
there was a wedge of import resources as well, and Bob will get into those.
Yeah, I was just curious to see
afternoon.
kind of what that breakout looked like, but it sounds like you're going to talk about that this afternoon.
Yep.
My third question, very short. So the cost outcomes that you talked about kind of in the beginning, the cost to customers, am I right in understanding that for the costs that you think customers would bear, you were not focusing on cost outcomes in the rec markets, but cost outcomes from the capital cost of the resources themselves? In other words, did you assume that whatever it cost to build the resource, including a profit for the developer, that's kind of what showed up in the customer's bill?
Yeah, so I'll answer that, and then I can be corrected if I need to be. But so the capital cost and capital cost structure are what fed into the premium calculation, but it's the premium that we then translated into the bill impact. So it's that assumed premium that then translated into that less than 1% bill impact.
Okay. Just a slight policy comment. I think it's important to look at the way the rec markets function, because I think ultimately under the design that staff put forward, it's really the cost outcomes of the rec markets that will determine what customers pay, and not necessarily, what a developer is
That's
actually
a really
paying.
good point to put in your comments.
Thank you. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And just come on up. Let me, while Carl's on a roll, we have one, which Carl deals with the social cost of carbon as a driver, and it's from Roger Cieza, the Environmental Energy Alliance of New York. And he noted, Carl, that you stated that one of the goals is to show how results change with different input cost drivers. The social cost of carbon is a primary driver for the benefits. The EPA published value relies on values of climate sensitivity, which are higher than the latest IPCC fourth assessment report of 2007 and the fifth assessment report of 2013. Inevitably, updated values for the social cost of carbon are going to have to incorporate lower climate sensitivity and lower the social cost of carbon benefit. Why wasn't this driver included in the analysis?
Sure. So we had a long discussion as part of leading up to the benefit cost analysis order on social cost of carbon, what discount rates could be used, what are some of the input assumptions that went into that process. Given that we consider that to be settled, we didn't do any sensitivity on the cost of carbon. Certainly I would welcome, in terms of written comment, if you have a suggestion on kind of what would be a defensible and informative sensitivity, we would welcome seeing it. But we do consider the costs of carbon as outlined in the BCA order as a settled matter. So we wanted to focus on the variables that were less settled, such as natural gas prices and interest rates.
Roger is a very prolific question asker, as we will come to see. But a related question is, how did you derive the tons of avoided carbon?
Sure. So for the avoided tons of carbon, again, following after our BCA order, we looked at what is the marginal emission rate for the New York State grid, and we said that's what's going to be displaced per the methodologies in the order. So looking at marginal carbon intensity, you multiply that by the dollar per ton that comes out of the EPA social cost of carbon, and that gives you a time series of the value of that carbon.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. This is Ann Reynolds from the Alliance for Clean Energy. I have two questions. I think they're almost yes-no answers, so they should be short. Almost. The first question is how DER is treated in the Tier 1 analysis. Did you just assume a certain amount of DER and then chop that off the obligation, meaning so the 100% PPA case, for example, would be 100% of the large scale?
Yes. So the answer is
Yes,
yes.
no.
So DER, the only assumption made about DER was New York Sun and the fulfillment of New York Sun. Given all the uncertainty in the ongoing process on the value of DER, we didn't want to make any prognostications about what new DER may or may not come on.
Were you going to say something?
And it's looking to me for elaboration, I think.
You looked like you wanted to say something.
Okay, so importantly, nothing in the cost study suggested that DER would not be eligible to contribute beyond the amounts shown. Just as a matter of simplification of something that was a nearly intractably large analysis. Given the many moving parts that would impact the premium, as Carl mentioned, we determined not to try to model that contribution, but ultimately if there's more supply available from any source, that's going to make the supply curve more robust and would tend to drive the cost down lower than what we show.
Thanks. So my second question was about the offshore wind analysis and the maturity phases that you mentioned. I was wondering if you moved from the current state to the next maturity phase based on the passage of time, or was it based on a certain amount of deployment of offshore wind in the United States or in New York?
In an omniscient world, it would be some combination, but probably more of the latter. In a analysis that has to move from beginning to end, it was assumed that these things happen as a function of time. With the expectation that the market beyond just New York would be getting to the volumes that got you to those levels of maturity in approximately that amount of time.
Okay. Thanks.
I want to do two things before you ask your question. First is I want to acknowledge that our chair, Audrey Zilberman, has joined us for a little while. And Audrey may have noticed that John Rhodes is in the back. I want to thank you both. On behalf of the staff now, a project like this is certainly daunting. All of us, not just Eric, has spent an incredible amount of time, really since early December through now, through the holidays, through personal and family crises and illnesses and the like, pursuing this, and we're able to do it because of the support of John and Audrey, and from a resource point of view and from a contribution point of view. So I want to, on behalf of all of us, extend our thanks. And I also want to now take a quick question from the web. This is from Michelle Lee, the chair of the Council on Intelligent Energy and Conservation Policy. Were there any non-governmental consultants who contributed to the analysis for Tier 3? If so, who were they? Also, is there a list of the studies used to support Tier 3? Jeff?
So, yeah, to this Jeff Hogan. There were no non-governmental support for the calculations in Tier 3. As I mentioned, it was really as simple as using Gunay RSSA costs, the energy forecasts that were in the CES already, and a proposal on a way to come up with a quantity of ZECs. So that was relatively straightforward, and there was nothing else. There was a Part B there, Scott? Could you repeat that?
Any studies?
Any studies?
Any studies? No, there wasn't. I mean, I mentioned I referenced the Brattle Group report that's been out there. Just been a couple different ones on both New York as a whole as well as upstate New York. Their numbers are a little bit different than ours, the staff's, in terms of emissions avoided and such, but it's all around the margins. So we certainly have read different things that are public, but no specific report was used to develop the Tier 3 numbers.
Thank you.
Seth Kaplan, EDP Renewables. I mean, I have to say that last slide, the flat line, I don't know if Tina felt the same way, but I suddenly flashed back 10 years to Franz Litz presenting the initial RGGI modeling and saying, well, the result is it's mildly positive, but it's kind of lost in the noise of all the other factors for energy prices, as after a massive multi-month, huge staff, analysis. So, I mean, my question is, and I don't know sure if this is a question for the agency folks giving instructions to the consultants or it's for the consultants, just a little bit of give you a chance to just elaborate on why the only benefit that was focused on was the social cost of carbon. I mean, given NYSERDA's long experience looking at other benefits of projects, and you know the many potential benefits in terms of freeing up gas on the pipeline system for use for home heating, and you know potential lowering of gas basis because of reduction in demand from gas-fired power plants as the renewables come online, and all the other myriad benefits that one might look at. It's just a little surprising. The focus solely on the social cost of carbon, and just give you a chance to explain why that focus was made.
Sure. So thanks for the question. So that was a directive of us. So again, we were following this many month-long BCA order process, and as articulated there are the health benefits from avoided NOx and SOx that's embedded in the KEROS price forecast. So there are markets for NOx and SOx. And so the outcome of that order was that the health benefits are already baked in. The decision was that the carbon value exceeded what we forecast baked into KEROS, and so that's why we layered on top this additional social cost of carbon. You articulated well that NYSERDA certainly cares about the kind of myriad other benefits that are out there. Those tend to be much harder to quantify. I think we have actually, even only including the additional carbon, we're showing a very strong benefit. And so I think we can say that that was a conservative approach, and that there are going to be ecosystem services benefits. There's going to be benefits to water quality. So there are a host of other non-quantified benefits. And certainly, I would welcome you to submit your thoughts as what those other benefits are and any methodologies, because that would only add to the benefit story.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Jessica Aguilé with Alliance for a Green Economy. Thanks for the opportunity to ask a few questions. So this just really quick, Mr. Hogan, can you just talk a little bit in more detail about the statement about the costs for Tier 3 kind of disappearing? Is that just because you're projecting market rates to rise? Is that why?
Short answer, yes.
Okay.
A little bit longer answer is, you saw the graphs that we had there, and there is some speculation that things, especially in the near term, could be lower. But by 2022, 2023, if you have a return to gas prices where we've seen them in the past, you will have $60 plus per megawatt hour revenue coming into these plants. And if their costs are, let's say 50 now, as Exelon stated, theirs are, revenues will exceed costs, and you won't need the ACP will be calculated as zero. So that was the reason.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I heard that right. And you're not taking into account any potential escalation of costs of nuclear reactors as part of that?
There was actually a forecast of an increase in costs, essentially inflation, that was expected. Now, again, it's really illustrative because, as I said in a call last month where the nuclear industry is really pushing for productivity gains and has aspirational goals of 30% cuts in their costs. We would expect it to be some productivity gains that will be offsetting some of that inflation. But we also would be expecting to set these costs on almost a year-by-year basis probably. So we would be able to capture any productivity gains that are ongoing. But our numbers did include an inflationary aspect to it. But even with that inflationary aspect, we didn't get to $60 by 2023. Revenues had exceeded costs by that point.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So there was sort of a range of costs given for the nuclear tier over the next few years. And in contrast with a lot of the kind of detail provided about Tier 1 and Tier 2 and sort of showing different modeling based on different assumptions, I haven't seen any similar kind of modeling based on various scenarios. And I know you gave this range because you're trying to account for a lot of different scenarios, but I'm wondering if we're going to be able to see any of the methodology behind the range of costs that were provided.
The reason why there wasn't a lot of detail is essentially we didn't want to tell the dealer what we wanted to pay per month. We didn't want to we didn't want to go in and estimate what we think the costs are and put that out there, and perhaps prejudice the upcoming discussions and talks we're going to have with those who want to sell these ZECs. It's going to be, to a degree, a negotiation, almost like a rate case, in terms of identifying what their costs are, what components of those costs should be included in the analysis of calculating the ACP. Putting forth that level of detail, and again, just based on the Gannett publicly available information, I don't know that it serves a lot of purpose. I think people will become fixated on that number as staff's first position, while really what we need to do is see the confidential data, a plant by plant basis, scrub that as we have staff who has done that very often in rate cases, scrub that data and try to develop really an accurate cost for these plants. So we didn't feel that releasing the detail would be productive.
But that said, there will be a process, an appropriate process, and process been relied on before, as Jeff alluded to, in rate cases and other proceedings, where we will be reviewing and other parties will be able to review, subject to all the appropriate protections and constraints, the information upon which decisions would be made.
So I know I'm not supposed to make comments about this.
No, you're not, and we welcome them when it's time to comment. Thanks.
Okay, I guess
Thank
I
you.
would just say
Thank
the
you.
lack of detail makes it hard for us to
No, no.
comment on the cost study.
I understand, and you may want to comment on the lack of detail and suggest a process by which you'd like to get it.
Okay. And then
Thank you.
my final question about
Sure,
the
right? Because we wanted to
yeah,
time for others.
just to confirm, so in terms of the net cost benefit, there were none of the environmental costs of nuclear. There was no attempt to put any price on those, right? We're just talking about the net of cost of carbon.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Jess. Come on up, but first let me relay a couple questions, excuse me, from Jeff Bishop of Brookfield Renewable. These are related to, there are three short questions related to Tier 2B. First, there was no ACP defined for Tier 2B. What is the ACP New York is considering? I think the active verb there is considering, and that will be something that will be developed, as will the other ACPs following or as the latter part of this process. The second question is, the cost study made it seem that Tier 2B had just costs instead of benefits as well. Why did the study not include the benefits of carbon emission reductions like were modeled in other tiers? Carl?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We looked at Tier 2B and felt that the cost estimation process for these resources that we thought wouldn't be able to export would be a very low cost. There's a significant amount of energy that's associated with it, and therefore a significant amount of future avoided carbon. We did estimate the magnitude of that carbon. We thought to be more conservative as our first cut. We wouldn't value that carbon given that we estimate only a very low premium level. So we have put an estimate of what that carbon is going to be. We think it's significant. So it isn't that we don't think there are carbon benefits, but we didn't want to overwhelm our benefit cost analysis with the valuation of that large carbon value.
I'd just like to add two additional things. One is that the white
Is
paper.
your mic on?
I'm sorry, maybe not close enough.
Okay.
The white paper, Appendix A, page 6, did go into some detail regarding how 2B was determined, kind of those flat line estimates that you saw, and that was essentially looking at neighboring states, and 50 cents to $2 per rec had been seen. So that's where the dollar amount came from. And while while that's an additional revenue for these entities, there's no guarantee that that alone is going to keep them operational. When you look at Tier 3, for instance, the point of that payment is to keep them operational, and therefore I think you can have a stronger correlation between the payment and the benefit achieved. I think there's a lot less correlation with 2B.
Good. One more 2B question. States and adjacent markets such as Massachusetts and Connecticut are looking at procuring any clean energy available to meet their carbon emission reduction targets. How does this influence the cost study's views of Tier 2A and Tier 2B when other states don't draw a distinction. Distinction between 2A and 2B.
Well, one of the overriding principles that NYSERDA and staff had was to try to minimize the costs, and so you don't want to make it too complicated and have 23 different tranches of renewables, but you don't want to pay $30 per megawatt hour for something that you could pay 2 or 3 and have the rec. So I think that cost minimization was one reason. I don't know if anyone wants to expand.
I mean, and the other key differential is, we're estimating that a fair amount of the renewables are going to have trouble getting out of the state. So that's also the part of it. So it's trying to look at what has a competitive market that we might have to pay spot market neighboring prices for, and what might we not need to.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, Jennifer Metzger with Citizens for Local Power. I wanted to also ask a question about relating to distributed generation, and actually asked one of my questions. Thank you for that. Where we have been concerned about the interaction between REV and the goal to sort of promote the build out of distributed generation and the clean energy standard. You might not be able to answer this question, but I want to just put it out there. Distributed generation has certain cost benefits, of course, in terms of, capacity, transmission, distribution costs are lower. And we just want to be concerned that the clean energy standard could not actually inadvertently impact markets for distributed generation, for community DG, for instance, for those smaller installations, just because of the economies of scale of LSR. So I don't know if you can speak to that question now, but it's definitely one we hope will be considered.
Yep. Okay. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Darren Suarez with the Business Council of New York State. And I had just one question, I have 2 questions. The first one being is, so as it's currently sort of drafted, do you think the study reflects both the high and a low of the potential cost for ratepayers?
So I would say yes, we're trying to capture in our range of sensitivity analysis what would be the high and the low given certain cost drivers.
And when you look at, and I guess the follow-up to that is, so you use the term gross costs throughout to mean gross costs are the costs, but they less actually the energy costs and also the capacity costs. That, by excluding it, making sort of that as part of it, haven't you baked into it some assumptions regarding the cost of energy that in the out years particularly sort of obviously lead to a repression of the potential cost of the program?
So we do include forecasts of the cost of energy and capacity. So the value of that energy and capacity is both a benefit and a cost, which is why it's not included in the gross premium when you do a societal benefit cost test. To the degree that those forecasts have uncertainty, they certainly do, which is why we're trying to characterize the range of that uncertainty between our high and our low cases. We'd welcome any comments if you think that high and low, could be a broader range.
It seems as though that actually to be more reflective, or the study to actually be reflective of what the potential highs and lows are, it would seem as though that you would have gone and in the past, NYSERDA, when they have done studies, they've actually looked specifically at the ratepayer impacts. Would that be something you would look at in terms of not just the impacts, but actually the cost of the program? And that would also include not only the, if you were to keep sort of energy cost constant or basically use a multiplier associated with CPU and then consumer price index, CPI. So then also use something similar for one of the other drivers here is you're seeing a significant demand dropping, and you're projecting significant demand reductions in demand. It would seem as though that it would be more reflective of what, potential the highs and lows are to sort of put out a study that had both low energy costs and also consistent basic energy usage.
Okay, there were a number of threads there. They're interesting. We can talk more afterwards and see how we can fold that in.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Kevin, come on up. Let me just pose a question from the internet. This is from Michael Zimmerman, who is with the New York Department of State. His first question is, this is a avoided cost of carbon question. Does the financial benefit of avoided carbon emissions, i.e. social cost of carbon, include in the cost study white paper include only those benefits that accrue to New York ratepayers, or are those benefits distributed more broadly, e.g. worldwide? And if these avoided carbon financial benefits accrue beyond New York ratepayers, has the per ton value of carbon been prorated accordingly?
Okay, so again, this is a bit of a discourse that dates back to the benefit cost order. So, there was a good and healthy debate of attribution of carbon benefits. And so I guess I would refer folks to take a careful look at EPA's social cost of carbon, and we've done direct attribution per those methodologies.
Thank you. Hello, Kevin.
Good morning. Kevin Lang for the City of New York. One general question and a couple specific questions. The general question is that in the cost study and even in the conversation, the presentations you've made this morning, there's a lot of very generalized discussions about the assumptions and the methodology. The spreadsheets that were provided were hard files. There was no calculations in them. There was no sources. Are you willing to provide to parties so that we can understand what you've done, your actual model, and the facts, figures, and calculations, and how you reached your conclusions? We and others have had great difficulty in trying to understand how you got to those conclusions. And while it is a lengthy PowerPoint presentation, there are not a lot of the basic facts or calculations. So can all of that be provided to us?
So we can provide you details on all the methodologies and all the assumptions so you can replicate the work. We can't actually give you a proprietary software package that is outside of New York State's control and ownership, but we'd be happy to give you as many details as you need so you can replicate it, because the math embedded in the model is less critical than all those input assumptions.
Well, and it's the inputs that we're struggling to understand what those inputs were.
Right.
And even in the discussions today, you talk generally about them, but not what the actual inputs. And
so we'd be more than happy to provide a full list of inputs for you. So anything that goes beyond our 300 slide deck, we can certainly give you more.
Could that be posted to DMM?
Certainly.
Right.
Yep.
And then the specific questions with respect to transmission costs. In the CS comments, there was a number of observations that to build out the system that is necessary, there's going to need to be a lot more transmission built. Were the cost of that transmission included anywhere in the analysis? I'm not talking about the generator leads. I'm talking about the actual transmission.
Sure. So I don't have the numbers right in front of me because that was one of the slides that was trimmed in Scott's panic that we were going to take too much time. There were assumptions. Basically, we took an approach that looked at some of the recent analysis that was done for potential upstate to downstate transmission enhancements. We used data from one of the particular sources there that, if I remember correctly, was a $1.2 billion line that could move 1,000 megawatts more supply as a proxy. We distilled that into a number that came out to about $30 per kilowatt year. We assumed that part of that was attributed to energy resource interconnection service, and a part of it was attributed to capacity resource interconnection service. And for the larger projects upstate, effectively they're bearing the higher end of those costs. For smaller projects that can locate more effectively, aim for locations that have lower interconnection costs, we assumed a lower proportion of that was included. So there are slides in the bigger deck that lay out those specific assumptions. So that was a fairly generic approach to assuming a level of network upgrade costs that might be required in aggregate. The state resource plan is going to take a look at that at with a much sharper point.
Forgive me for not fully understanding that, but there's a lot of additional transmission that's going to be needed. So did you just come up based on the cost of a single line and say that these projects are going, I'm just trying to understand that methodology, that you just assumed a per megawatt hour cost based on that one line, but not the cost of additional transmission?
Again, that was a generic approach to a very complex site-specific set of facts that will ultimately be experienced and revealed through individual interconnection studies. So it was important to us to not ignore what is going to be a real cost, that there will need to be transmission upgrades. We put in a placeholder that was representative, and again, the state resource plan is looking at that and looking to enhance that that knowledge base and that result.
Yeah, thanks. The other
Yeah, I guess the other point would be, I think it's early to presume the magnitude of the transmission upgrades, depending if it's offshore downstate versus upstate wind. It's going to be specific to the resources. So hence, doing scenarios as part of our state resource plan is going to give us a lot more information.
I would agree with you on location, but there's definitely going to need to be more transmission. But moving on, the other question I had, in the societal cost analysis that you did, earlier there was some discussion of the federal tax credits and the benefits they provide. But in a societal cost analysis, did you take into account the cost of those federal tax credits because we have to pay for them?
So our standard practice, which we've done for the RPS evaluation, we've done for many years now, is that looking at our societal cost test from a New York vantage point. So those federal dollars are not considered part of that.
Even though New Yorkers are paying a portion of them?
A small portion of them, yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Please come up, and for David Clark, who is participating through the web, I think your question was just addressed as best as it can be. Please.
Hi, Jordan Giroux, Pace Energy and Climate Center. I have a question about the comparative premiums between PPAs and the REC-only model, and I imagine this might be a difference of metrics, or it might be a difference of the scale of the programs you're talking about versus over the summer. But let me give you 2 data points, and maybe you can help resolve them for me. So in the slides you presented today and in the CES cost study, you talk about the bill impact from PPAs being 0.28%, while for REC only it would be 0.62%. My understanding, based on what I've seen, and you gave a brief mention of this to Chris earlier, is that pretty much derives directly from the premium that you're paying for these resources, and that seems to be about a 2-to-1 ratio. You go back to the LSR options paper over the summer, and it was much closer to 1.5, something like $21 to $30. So I'm wondering, does that derive from a difference in the metrics? Is that a difference in the program scale, or how did that ratio bloom between the 2 pieces of information we're looking at there?
All right, let me take a stab at that. So first of all, calculating a ratio is actually a meaningless way to look at this. It's not the appropriate way. It's the values are derived by looking at a levelized cost of energy compared to the market value of energy. So if the market value moves, the premium changes substantially. So one of the things that changed was a different market price forecast. The other thing that is materially different is in that initial study that you're referring to, we were looking at a single illustrative block, a 100-megawatt wind farm that had a particular set of characteristics, and looked at what that would cost under a variety of different circumstances. The supply curve is looking at all the potential supply, so some of it's cheaper, some of it's more expensive. So it's fundamentally a different analysis. We actually did compare and benchmark those, and it was very consistent for that block. But the supply curve analysis is a far more sophisticated and detailed analysis, which also had updated assumptions on things like market prices and costs.
Thanks. I have a second. I have a second question, if I may, and I think this is really just asking you to speak a little more about something that there's not a lot of backup behind in the white paper. You have for the ZEC market, your cost estimates varying by around 600 million, while net benefits vary around 100 million, which, needless to say, is pretty counterintuitive. So I don't know if you can just explain how you get to, because it seems like you are building, you're modeling the same amount of gigawatt hours being produced over the same term, regardless. So how do you vary one of those without the other?
I'm sorry. Could you do? Is there a specific number that you had a concern with, or?
Yeah, I mean, it was in your slides, and I think it is on slide 84 in the actual white paper, and you have gross program costs varying from 59 to 658, and net program costs varying from 928 to 1.08. So there's about a factor of 5 difference in there. So what's the other piece of that analysis that we should expect that you were tracking there?
So if I understand your question correctly about the relative difference between the gross program costs and the net program costs, the underlying factor there is that we're taking a conservative approach on what carbon benefits we're counting. So to put simply, we were only counting carbon benefits for nuclear generation that at any point in time over the study period actually receives a top-up payment. And depending on the different scenarios, not every kilowatt hour of nuclear generation does, which means that if in one scenario there's a higher level of nuclear generation that receives subsidy, then that means there's a higher level of generation for which we count carbon benefits. So the point I'm making is you're not counting the same amount of carbon benefits in each scenario. And that's why between the scenarios and therefore between the ranges, there is a mismatch, if you will, once you move from gross to net.
Thank you.
Thank you. Come on up, and before you ask your question, I have another question from Roger Cieza of the Environmental Energy Alliance of New York. This is about capacity factors. His question is, where are the capacity factors coming from? Page 34, Tier 1 cumulative capacity deployed graph, and the spreadsheet with the various values proposes 18 megawatts of deployed land-based wind that produces 55 gigawatt hours of power from page 35, Tier 1 cumulative generation. Everybody following that? Yeah, I assume I see somebody's pulling out the book. This is from the cost study. Yeah, that works out to 35% capacity factor, which is significantly different than the statewide average capacity factor for land-based wind. You want to do that this afternoon? Okay. Stay tuned, Roger. One quick question from Jeff Bishop. Where do NYPA's projects fit into the cost study?
So the NYPA projects are considered baseline, essentially that all of New York State customers have paid for these projects, and that any what you would call REC associated with their generation is to be shared by all New Yorkers. So there is no additional need to pay NYPA for those RECs. That was the approach that was taken in the cost study.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Keith Shue, Technical Advisor for Otsego 2000. First of all, I want to thank each of you, and I want to thank the chair of the PSC for the tremendous amount of work you're doing. Last year, when the State Energy Plan came out, we were frankly a little concerned that some of these topics would be glossed over. That hasn't happened. You all are spending a tremendous amount of effort on this, and we genuinely appreciate that. This is a difficult subject. It's a very difficult subject, and I recognize that. And it's not something that lends itself to answers that come from sound bites. It's something that there's real difficult work and difficult decisions that need to be made. Having said that, we know that the only way to make progress in bringing greenhouse gas reductions down is to reduce fossil fuel consumption, and so we recognize the value of all three of the tiers as part of that solution. On that kind of leads me to my question. When you're talking about greenhouse gas reduction, a statement was made earlier today that there will be a higher carbon benefit with higher load. And I think that was made with reference to just the renewable aspect of it. When you look at the whole piece of the pie, the 50% renewables and the 50% non-renewables, if we have higher load, it means the whole pie is bigger, and that means we'll be using more fossil fuels as well on the other side of the pie, which means that emissions actually could rise. By our analysis of it, it looks like there's sensitivity factors here in terms of demand, in terms of the nuclear component. And if demand rises, then that could potentially eviscerate our greenhouse gas reduction goals. And I'm wondering if you all are going to be performing some kind of sensitivity analysis on not just the high load implications for cost, but also for the carbon implications. I think that would be very useful.
I can answer that last part. I don't know if Eric, if you want to clarify the point you had made earlier about that. But so this is not an analysis of load or energy efficiency programs. So we were just doing load as a sensitivity to inform the cost of the CES. So that would be a separate exercise. We won't be looking at energy efficiency and the carbon benefits that would be attributed to different levels of energy efficiency.
Okay. I mean, clearly the overall effect of what we're trying to do here is bring greenhouse gas emissions down. So both halves of that pie actually become.
And I agree with your point. I think Eric's point was more that if you have more renewables coming on, you're going to have more carbon avoided. So you have a larger dollar amount. But you're right, overall, with more load, if 50% is still fossil, then you're going to have more overall emissions.
Absolutely. So that's something we're looking at. On the subject of exports, something was stated about how you believe it's probably not likely that we'll be importing renewables from the New England area, but we might be exporting renewables, and that's a consideration. We also think that's a consideration and a potential problem as it relates to non-renewables, fossil fuels. One of the things that is kind of missing in this analysis here is, as we're trying to build more renewables, whether they come from in-state or out-of-state, the question becomes: are we going to be exporting more fossil fuel energy in the process too? We're looking at the big picture. What is our actual contribution to greenhouse gas reduction? So can that be kind of brought into the fold of at least some analysis of how much additional fossil fuel energy, electricity export might be occurring?
So again, I think that's out of the scope of a CES cost study, but if you want to supply some of those comments and thoughts, we also all wear the hat of the energy plan, which is a much broader look at the energy system, and certainly something we'll be analyzing as part of that process.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning. My name is Clint Plummer. I'm with Deepwater Wind. My question is the reciprocal of Kevin's. Kevin asked the question about how are you accounting for the additional transmission costs that are needed to deliver this energy. I think there's another factor on the opposite side of it, which is to say that in the 2014 Reliability Needs Assessment, the NYSO says that we will need an additional 1,200 megawatts of new generation or transmission capacity downstate by 2024. Now, as a downstate ratepayer, that's something that's going to affect me and millions of other New Yorkers as a real actual cost on their bills. As part of the CES, we're talking about building potentially thousands of megawatts of new generation. And so my question is, have you considered how the addition of these thousands of megawatts of new renewable generation could be used to help defer or completely offset the need to build capacity in new places in the state where new capacity is already needed?
So the constraints that are in the system where new transmission might be built to meet those are actually made real through the various LMPs. So downstate LMPs are higher because of those constraints and needs. So to the degree that the LMPs that we're forecasting, and we do forecast them to be higher, and capacity values higher downstate, that's reflected in our market forecasts. So there's the embedded value of the costs of having to build new capacity, and the transmission constraints are embedded in the capacity forecast and the energy forecasts.
So your assumption is simply that the existing market fully captures the value that's necessary to build a new power plant in Zone J or Zone K?
It's our existing forecast, and that's why the capacity costs go up over time. It's because eventually you're going to hit the cost of new entry, and that's going to be that avoided cost.
And so the existing model includes that assumption that the capacity market prices increase to the point of accounting for the cost of building a new power plant.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Come on up, but
Thank you. Red Miller Militich from the Independent Power Producers of New York. A couple questions. Do the cost forecasts presume a certain REC only or energy and REC price for the amount acquired under the future solicitations? Is there a specific REC price that you have in mind in these calculations?
Well, the prices are not an input but an output, a result of the analysis.
Okay. And then the other question has to do with providing more information on how you get from a total indicated cost of all of the tiers of $3.6 billion to a cost of less than 1% impact on electricity bills. I guess just more background information on how you do that calculation and train of thought.
Sure. Yeah. So I think you're referring to the appendix that had the long-term view. So that
right,
was
the macro numbers that were in
2030
the table for all three tiers, correct?
Yeah. So that 3.6 billion is spread over many years, and our system is a $20 billion system each year. So you look at how you spread those costs over all those years of operation, and you get an average bill impact of less than 1%. And I'm happy to give you some more details.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
thank you, Kevin.
This morning, I think, Eric, it might have been you, but Carl, it might have been you, had talked about, through the short term, the belief is that there's going to be enough RECs available from RPS and New York Sun. The latest report from NYSERDA, the 2015 annual report, indicated that RPS main tier has only hit 60% of its target. Are you assuming that quantity of RPS that's available, or are you assuming 100% of the RPS target for what's available?
I might have to refer to others to where the original amount of LSR forecasts came from, but the point that I did make in my presentation was that indeed those forecasts fluctuate, and so I showed a number of updated scenarios where the original numbers came from. Jeff, do you want to comment in more detail?
Sure. So the targets that were in the white paper that we originally had assumed that what had been awarded in the RPS solicitations to date would be coming online essentially 3 years after the auction, a little over 2.5, I guess. So the 2015 auction solicitation would, any projects that were achieved through that would come online in 2018 and be available, and targets were built around that. As Eric's slide, which had kind of here's where we were in 2050, the left-hand bar of the 2015 through 2018 time period said here's where we were a couple months ago, but we know of some delays. We know of some contract things that are occurring that are going to lead to lower levels of megawatt hours being produced by the projects that won those solicitations. So you're right that not everything comes to fruition, and it doesn't come to fruition on exactly the time frame that you think it's going to do. There's been changes since we originally made our forecast. I think when we set the targets, we need to be mindful of that. We need to be mindful of the possibility for such slippage. We're already trying to think through how to change the targets. Like if we did a white paper today, we would have a different target schedule than the one that we originally put out. I don't know if
So that will become an input, obviously, for the commission as they set the target schedules for the near term. It also illustrates one of the reasons why we've built in, from a staff point of view, the proposed 3 triannual review periods. So the commission can take cognizance of those fluctuations as they occur and make adjustments to projected acquisition schedules.
So that leads into the other question I had. If your forecast is off of now I understand the forecast, it's not based on a theoretical, it's based on what's been contracted, but given the changes you know of some that you've just identified, leads into the whole ACP. If there are not actually enough RECs out there, then people are and the commission hasn't adjusted the target, they're going to have to set the ACP. The other part of this question is that when the commission rolled this out with the white paper in January, it indicated it was going to be adopting a clean energy standard in June. That was its target date. That was going to take effect at the beginning of 2017. When is it that we're going to know exactly what the ACPs are, since we might have to start buying or paying the ACP if we can't acquire the RECs? Will those be known at the time the commission adopts a clean energy standard, or are those not going to be known to the public until some later date?
I don't want to preempt the commission's decision-making process, but if they could be in the order, if they're not in the order, it will be following a process that would be launched with the order, providing more than enough time for people to plan. But an important part of this interaction, Kevin, is that, as we've discussed, the acquisition schedule would be set based upon the number of RECs that are presumed to be available. So we're going to start, or presumably the commission will start, assuming that there's an equilibrium and that the ACP becomes one method of reconciling. Another is carryovers, banking and borrowing of obligations between periods. So I take your point, and this is some of the issues that will be addressed in the commission's order.
Yeah, I just, to that comment, Scott, if the commission is going to be adopting ACPs in this order, it would be helpful if we knew what they were and how they were calculated, that we have an opportunity to comment on them.
And that would be a good reason to anticipate that it might be in a following process. Okay, so I think we're done for this morning. Let me say, for anybody who has submitted other questions that you haven't heard on the web, that's because, in my judgment, they're really statements of policy or suggestions of policy, which we welcome. But submit them again in your comments. We are 6 minutes ahead of schedule. Congratulations. We'll add it on to lunch. We'll reconvene at 1:30. Thank you. Grace and Bob will be walking us through the technology-specific methodology and modeling that was applied in the cost study. Bob, you're on.
Thank you, Scott. All right, so picking up again, there's a lot here, a lot more in the published cost study than we're going to be able to go through in the slides today, but we will kind of skim over a number of the interesting points, and I will again welcome any of you to ask questions about anything I talk about now or anything that is in the broader study. So as I mentioned earlier, we looked at a number of different resource types, land-based wind, offshore wind, utility-scale solar, imports that fell into the wind and hydro category, as well as small hydro, woody biomass, and a number of different configurations in biogas. Just as in the interest of time, I'm going to go into a lot less detail about the latter three, just so we can get through them. There was a lot less of that deployed, a lot more information in the full cost study that we can go to if people are interested. So I'm going to start off talking about land-based wind. And the approach that we took was a geospatial one, where we identified candidate windy sites, and our analysis reflected the site-specific nature of land-based wind, which is driven by the resource potential, which is very locational, by the production, which is driven by the technology, the hub height, and the wind speeds in a particular location, both the project cost and the interconnection cost. We also considered and reflected, as best one can, the reality that land-based wind is not easy to site, and so all the windy places aren't necessarily all the places that can get developed. So we took the raw resource potential and derated it or reduced it to reflect the varying likelihood of permitting success. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we did that. And then we developed a series of cost functions, which I'll describe, that represent the development cost variations associated with specific site characteristics. So, start off. There we go. Okay. All right, so those cost variations. We started with a idealized wind project. So there is publicly available information on the, we use the 2015 National Renewable Energy Lab annual technology baseline as a data source, as a recent and publicly available data source that we used where appropriate and made some adjustments to it. So we started with their kind of middle of the road idealized wind capital costs. So this is, we think of this as a big project in the plains in the Midwest. Windy, easy to build in farmland, idealized conditions, and large and capturing some significant scale economies. Very few of those conditions hold here in New York, and so we made a number of adjustments to apply to that starting point to reflect the cost characteristics of what we would expect of the specific sites that we were looking at. And then we, I'll step you through at a high level the types of adjustments we made. We spoke to a number of the developers that are active in this region to really benchmark, and had a lot of positive feedback that this approach was very accurately representing the types of costs that they're seeing. So we feel good about this approach. And so the first thing is a locational adjustment. So basically New York has a different cost of doing business in general than much of the rest of the country. EIA has some factors that they use to account for that. We also made an assumption about some of the additional challenges of siting and soft cost differences, the non-technology cost differences between a New York project and an idealized Central Plains site. And so together, we made a locational adjustment. We then made size adjustments. So again, that starting point cost was for a large project. Most of the projects that could be developed in New York are going to be smaller than that 200 megawatt project, and so we had a factor that reflected diseconomies of scale as you move to lower and lower megawatt scale sites. And lastly, we made a topography adjustment. So this reflects the fact that it costs more to build on top of a mountain or in rolling hills or places you have to build roads than it does in Midwest farmland. And so we had a number of factors there that represented the different topography in the region. Sure. So, I mean, the numbers themselves are in the cost study, so that they're all in the published document. So there are just multiplicative factors that for these less idealized sites scale up the installed costs by anywhere between 7 and 38% to account for locational adjustment, by anywhere from or by as much as 30% to account for the scale adjustment, and by as much as 22% to account for a expensive, difficult to build mountaintop site, and any number of points in between for project sites that are not at those extremes. Just double clutching on this thing today. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so over time, we projected capital expenditure to decrease with an experience curve. So again, we used numbers from the NREL's Annual Technology Baseline, or ATB, that are characteristic of the types of conditions in New York. And these decline over time in real terms. That's what's shown in the graph, a real decline. Interestingly, the last several years we've experienced nominal cost decreases in wind technology, the NREL forecast actually has a decrease at a lower rate than the rate of inflation. So as you'll see, the actual cost projections are shown as a slight increase in nominal terms, which I consider to be somewhat conservative compared to recent experience. Okay, so then we did our geospatial analysis and effectively either did not include a number of land use types where you would be unlikely to be able to develop wind, included setbacks from those types of sites, and considered those, the long list shown here, and which is in the cost supplement, as primary constraints or areas excluded from the analysis. The model can also probability derate additional secondary types of site characteristics. We didn't do this in this analysis, but we have information on the types of sites and this can be used for further consideration of how realistic it is, or whether there are other policy actions that might be taken to steer wind towards or away from various sites. So the individual sites were characterized. They were thought of as contiguous or near contiguous areas capable of hosting wind projects of at least 10 megawatts up to a few hundred megawatts. For those areas, we have information on the land area, the power density, or how many megawatts per square kilometer can actually be built, and those numbers vary with the topography. We characterize wind speeds at 4 different hub heights, 80, 100, 120, 140. Most of the development activity today is going on between 80 and about 110 meter hub height, but we've seen a lot of progression over time to taller turbines and longer blades. We characterize the average slope and elevation and the distance to the nearest transmission lines and substations at 5 different voltages. We also did a manual site characterization, and this is where that can it be permitted overlay came in here. So we did a Google Earth look at all of these different sites and assessed the proximity of neighbors, and the more people are around, the less likely it is that you're going to get developed. And so we categorized sites. If there was a highly populated area, we threw it out. If it had nobody around there, it was likely to be developable, and we derated that potential accordingly for a bunch of different categories. And so that led to a distribution of potential land-based wind sites. And you can see here, or if you could see here, since this is kind of small, a variety of different sites in different locations, which are consistent where development has been going on. A lot of these sites are red. The red ones are small. They have the poorest scale economies, are the most expensive, and so those are the ones that have turned out to be frequently the most costly and least likely to be developed. But this gives you a sense of where development may happen. I will reiterate that this is a probabilistic analysis. We're not saying any particular location here will be developed, but these are the various candidates that might be developed if they can be permitted, if they're cost effective. With respect to the capacity factors, we modeled the winds for the 4 hub heights, 80, 100, 120, and 140 megawatts, using a scalable generic wind turbine power curve that represents kind of a combination of representative existing technology. We assumed that the hub heights over time would progress towards taller and taller towers, and that was used as a proxy for also a combination of tower height and blade length, which increases the production of a of the turbine and therefore the capacity factor. And so we modeled an evolution of the capacity factors over time as a function of two things. One was the average fleet hub height evolving over time, and the other was technology advancement measured at a constant hub height. That technology advancement is shown on the next graph here. This was again derived from the NREL annual technology baseline. We reduced the technology advancement. So this is, think of this as an increase in capacity factor over time. We discounted the NREL ATB numbers by 50% so as not to double count the advancement that we're already capturing in the hub height part of the analysis. And at the end of the day, this gives us a supply curve. So this is a representation of the supply that's in the model. This is a subset, so those projects that are between 30 and 100 megawatts, we have similar sites characterized for less than 30, from 100 to 200, and for greater than 200. So this is illustrative, and you can see over time these different lines are snapshots over time in what's available and at what cost. So you'll see these for each of the technologies. We have numbers here. The shortest curve on the left, the light blue dotted one, if you can see it, represents the 2019 costs. They're lower because they have the PTC. Over time, we have a number of moving parts here. The loss of the phase down, then loss of the PTC, as well as the evolution of the other cost factors that over time make an unsubsidized project more cost effective. So you can see between the purple line representative of 2021 commercial operation and the next line, which is I guess orange, that the cost goes up, representing the end of the federal subsidies. Ultimately, in the long run, the last 2030 is a little higher than 2025, consistent with the rate of change, or inflation outpacing the experience curve. So next I'll talk about offshore wind. The methodology for offshore wind is a little different. It builds on a lot of different sources of data. Offshore wind we're in a really interesting period of time with respect to the information available about offshore wind, where a lot of the public information suggests costs that are fairly high, or what's been available in terms of public information until very recently suggests some fairly high costs, and very recent information out of Europe that suggests costs are expected to come down, are already starting to come down and expected to come down rather quickly. Very little information out there, public information, about how those costs might translate into the United States. So we built our analysis on a number of things. The very recently released Massachusetts study that was performed by the University of Delaware Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, the 2015 NREL ATB, and some earlier analysis that was commissioned by NYSERDA in 2012 that looked at the actual bottom-up costs and cost to interconnect for a number of projects in the Atlantic waters off of New York. And so we used that New York-specific data as a starting point, and we adjusted or extrapolated that over time using the SIOW 2016 Massachusetts study and the NREL ATB to reflect the confluence of a bunch of different things that are happening here. The latest European experience in cost reduction, scale economies, and generally industrialization of the offshore wind sector that might be reflected and propagated in New England as global learning. An increase in scale from the 5 megawatt class of turbines that have been installed now to larger turbines. The industry is moving to an 8 megawatt class and may even move to bigger projects down the line. what kind of U.S. learning and industry scaling can happen if we get an industry at scale in the United States. The availability of long-term revenue certainty, which has a lot to do with the cost, the existence and cost of supply chain and financing. Increased competition consistent with within Eastern U.S. commitment to deploy offshore wind at scale between now and 2030. So this presumes that there's an industry and that states other than just New York are driving at scale. And the commensurate development of a domestic supply chain that allows both investment in that supply chain and spreading the costs over a greater number of units. The sites that we considered were developed in this 2012 analysis that NYSERDA had commissioned and are shown here. So there were 6 sites that were studied or characterized. 5 of them we selected as the closest or more advanced or most representative of the resources, resource potential reasonably available during the study period. What you can see in the table here is the area of the site, its maximum build-out potential, and the last column is the amount of that potential we assumed to be available as part of the supply curve from each of these sites between now and 2030. So in aggregate, we assumed that up to roughly I think it's less than 8,000 megawatts might be available. The ultimate resource potential is larger than that. The other thing you can see on here is a number of interconnection points, which you'll note are in the greater New York City area and not on Long Island. So that's an important point. It may well be possible to connect some amount of offshore wind in Long Island, but the analysis that NYSERDA commissioned in 2012, as Siemens PTI had looked at this and had concluded that it would be A, difficult to site new transmission on Long Island, and B, that the ability to interconnect thousands of megawatts of offshore wind would not be viable on Long Island, and so that study effectively had some long cable runs to 345 kV interconnection points that could handle substantial amounts of supply. So the CapEx trajectory, the capital cost that we assumed was driven by a number of different things, and this is a bit of a busy slide, and I'm going to step you through a couple of pieces at a time here. First of all, the line at the top is the capital expense from the 2015 NREL ATB trajectory. Their mid case for wind speeds that are characteristic, wind speeds and water depths that are characteristic of New York. And you'll see that number's pretty high compared to some of the other curves. And in fact, from 2023 onward, the forecast actually increases in nominal terms. So while we looked to that, we also concluded that this was far too conservative relative to the information that's coming out of the industry now and what we're seeing in Europe. So the next line, this is the dark blue dotted line. So this is the trajectory that's consistent with that March 2016 special initiative on offshore wind CapEx trajectory. They had SAOW had projected three specific tranches of supply. We drew a curve through that. That is representative of some specific projects off of the Massachusetts coast. And you can see it's quite a bit lower than those NREL numbers. The line that we ultimately used in the base case here is a trajectory. So we started with the actual bottom-up 2015 costs from this analysis that was done, that NYSERDA commissioned in 2012, which represented those 5 sites that I referred to, and those numbers are actually quite consistent with the early point of that extrapolated SIOW trajectory. And we had also, some of our subcontractors here had benchmarked those against current cost in Europe, and they were fairly consistent. We trended that line over time using the rate of change in that top line, the NREL ATB trajectory, until the point of inflection. And thereafter, we trended it at the SIOW rate of change. So ultimately, it left us with a curve that looked like the dark blue line with the blue boxes, a number that's well below the NREL trajectory, but somewhat above the Massachusetts-specific numbers, and at least some of the difference there is driven by the interconnection cost. We also developed a high-cost sensitivity that used a less aggressive decline in cost in the post-ATB time period, or after 2023. Transmission interconnection cost is also an important driver, and unlike the rest of the analysis, the specific transmission and interconnection costs from that 2012 analysis were used for each of these sites. We used the costs that were developed for that study for energy resource interconnection service, but assumed that offshore wind would be able to access capacity revenue. Many of those sites in the preliminary analysis done in 2012 were expected to have or potentially experience some significant additional costs for capacity integration, but those costs are also the types of investments that would bring a lot of reliability benefits to the downstate area. So they were not directly incorporated here. So in deriving the T&I estimates, we made some specific assumptions. Most of the distance between the offshore wind project and onshore interconnection points was via undersea cable. The fraction of those costs associated with onshore facilities were assumed to be owned by the interconnecting utility, so they were financed at a different cost of capital. And the remainder was assumed to be financed by the project owner at the same cost of capital as the generation facilities. Those transmission interconnection costs were held constant in real terms through 2020, but we are seeing that there are a number of expected advances. While transmission interconnection is a fairly mature technology relative to offshore wind, there are innovations going on in interconnecting offshore wind to the grid, including moving some of the more complex facilities onshore that originally were done offshore in some of the early generation. And so we assumed an annual decrease by 1% in real terms from 2020 to 2030 to estimate the potential impact of some technological innovations that are that we expect, but still there's not very much information about. In terms of technology advancement, the capital expenditures and the operating expenditure figures reflect technology evolution, which includes both larger turbines at higher hub heights and other technology advances. Shown here is capacity factor assumptions. So our colleagues at AWS True Power had developed capacity factor assumptions associated with each of those specific sites using an 8 megawatt class wind turbine. And you can see in the bubble here to the left, the original capacity factors. Those were trended over time to represent some changes. The starting points were trended to first take advantage of capacity factors as NREL has been projecting them, and then convert that trajectory into an index, so to apply them to the specific sites that we looked at. So finally, what does that look like in terms of our supply curve? Again, we have very little supply. That purple area represents an expectation that you might be able to get the first project in the water before the production tax credit and the investment tax credit in lieu of PTC fully expires. So that first one is a cheaper subsidized project, but those subsidies are, at least as they currently exist, would be gone before most of the supply could be developable. Then over time, you can see the impact of global cost reductions and scale economies associated with market visibility. The important thing to focus on here is that there are some sites that are cheaper than others. So you have several thousand megawatts, say in the yellow 2030 line, that are substantially cheaper than the next several thousand megawatts. This is representative of things like having to go into deeper waters, having to build longer cables, and so forth. So, what was that last comment there? And we have a rapid increase in resource availability later due to market maturation. The next category is utility scale solar. So we haven't seen utility scale solar in this part of the world, though very large utility scale projects are being built in many other parts of the country right now. The approach to looking at solar here, we focused on an assumption that most of the utility scale projects that would compete in the Clean Energy Standard would be in the 10 to 30 megawatt scale. That's not to say that bigger projects can't or won't be developed, and in fact, a few of them probably will and will be cheaper than what's shown here. But over the course of the time between now and 2030, most of the development we expect to be in this scale. Again, we conducted a geospatial analysis looking at the total developable area. We modeled the photovoltaics as having a homogeneous cost other than the cost of interconnection and a homogeneous production based on where it is. In practice, that may or may not be reasonable. Property taxes is probably the other big swing factor where those taxes might vary, or payments in lieu of taxes might vary significantly, location to location. And perhaps in reality, the cheaper property tax places are where development goes first. If that is the case, then we've probably overstated the costs here. The resource blocks were aggregated by similar cost characteristics within each NYISO zone. So similar to the wind analysis, we made some scaling and New York-specific adjustments. In the top table here, we made some this is our starting point for installed cost. We looked at fixed tilt and single axis tracking in practice through our analysis. Fixed tilt was just barely more cost effective throughout the analysis period. We assumed in a conservative case, in the sensitivities whose results you've been shown, that there might be a higher cost associated with less maturation, but the base analysis starts with a fixed tilt of about $1,400 a kW DC, numbers that we've benchmarked with a number of folks in the development community. And we made some locational adjustments there. Again, this EIA regional siting factor, which accounts for the different costs of labor, a small adjustment, 2% adjustment to consider the greater soft costs of getting projects developed and built in New York versus some idealized places where there are a lot fewer people and fewer lawyers around, and multiply those together to have a siting factor. In general, it was expected that the cost of developing solar downstate, New York City, would be about 28% of the above the kind of national average numbers, and in Long Island even higher, close to 50% higher, because of those types of factors, mostly this EIA factor that represents just the cost of doing business in those locations. We used a capital expenditure trajectory over time that, well, to back up, solar has been experiencing some rather stunning year-over-year cost decreases over the last several years. We wanted to use a publicly available resource here and something as recent as possible. So the lower line here is a November 2013 capital expenditure trajectory from Greentech Media. We found those numbers. Oh, actually, the orange line is the Greentech Media line. So that trajectory actually started increasing in nominal terms after 2020, and we found that to be extraordinarily conservative relative to what we're seeing in the marketplace. So we made an adjustment to that after 2020 to continue 1% per year nominal decreases, and that's the trajectory that we used. Those who are following solar development recently might find this to be a fairly conservative estimate, but again, we wanted to use something that was recent and public, and that was the what we applied. We also did a geospatial analysis here, ruled out a lot of different potential land uses that were not expected to be compatible with solar development. We did not assume any development on agricultural land, for example. We had we only considered areas that were within 2 miles of roads, within 3 miles of existing substations. There's lots of land, but nobody's going to be building far away from infrastructure when there's plenty of potential sites near infrastructure. We assumed a 7.5 acres per megawatt density, and we looked at the contiguous areas capable of hosting projects of at least 10 megawatts in scale as potential sites. And we ended up with sites that were in these places. These are characterized by a few different land use types. In red, which there aren't very many of, barren land. Orange is scrubland. The light green is grassland. The darker green is pasture and hayland. So we basically assumed that these are the types of land use types that utility scale solar are likely to be built on of the scale, and we only assumed that 25% of this land that would fell into the pasture or hayland category would be developable. We used standard tools to estimate the capacity factors of those various sites. Not a very controversial thing. And we came up with a supply curve again. So here each curve represents the amount of supply that was assumed to be available over time. This is constrained by the ability to ramp up the industry over time. We assumed that the industry capability could more or less double whatever it had built in the prior year in a subsequent year. So that's why we have lines that represent a rapid increase over time of potential build out. You wouldn't expect to have 2,000 megawatts built in a year after there had been none. It takes some time to build the industry up to that level of deployment. You'll see the impact here of the phase down of the ITC. So some of the earlier curves are cheaper. Once you lose the ITC, then you move into the period of time where the technology evolution and cost matter. The experience curve starts driving down cost over time thereafter. So next I'm going to talk about imports. We did assume that not just New York supply was eligible, but supply in surrounding regions. And here are assumptions. Sorry about that. So we assumed that resources from adjacent control areas that were capable of being delivered to New York would be considered, and took something of a simplified modeling approach here. We didn't analyze in as much detail as we did for resources within New York. We focused on those resources that were most likely to import or to export to New York over existing transmission facilities. So we looked at the physical existing transmission interties and the competing usage on those ties, available space on those ties that was used to estimate the assumed practical transfer limits for projects that would need to have reliable long-term access to New York in order to get financed. We did consider competing native demands and internal transmission constraints within neighboring control areas that might limit the amount that could be imported into New York. Additional factors that we considered include what zone the supply was delivered into. That impacted its market value in the New York ISO markets. The potential transaction costs and risks of the export-import transaction. There's basis risk, there's losses, there's in some cases transmission costs, electric losses, and the potential loss of the ability to monetize capacity revenue in the exporting market or in NISO. So in looking at the particular resources that we considered, we looked at the resource potential and did a cost analysis of land-based wind that was similar in nature to what I've described here. And so looking at each area, ISO New England, we characterize the land-based wind potential. PJM, we characterize the land-based wind potential. Ontario and Quebec as well. In Ontario, we also characterize the eligible or small hydro potential, again meeting the current main tier RPS rules. In Quebec, we sought to characterize the small hydro potential, but there really wasn't any public data that we could get our hands on there, and most of the development activity going on is in Quebec is at the large scale, which, at least for this analysis, was assumed to not be eligible. So that's what we considered. There were some constraints again on the out-of-state resources. So PJM, we assumed that the portion of eastern PJM states' RPS demands were effectively met first from that supply. So PJM demands eat first. What's available after that is available for export to New York. We also assumed that within PJM, wind supply from Ohio and westward was assumed to be inaccessible or too costly to move to New York due to west to east transmission constraints, which are prevalent. Now, there are some transmission facilities that are being considered and planned, and if some of those new transmission facilities were built, allowing the ample Midwest supply to access New York, that could potentially be a game changer, but that's not considered in this analysis. In terms of Ontario, there's also a local procurement policy. We assume that those demands were met first out of the available supply before additional supply available to export to New York. We also assume that supply from northern and western Ontario was limited by material internal transmission constraints and further blocked from getting through the general Toronto area, which is a bit of a transmission bottleneck. New England supply we ultimately excluded here while there are strong demands in New England, and New England is going to be struggling to be able to meet their own supply. We did not expect substantial. This is despite the current and proposed flow from New York to New England. It was a little hard to conceive that the flow would likely go the other direction in any material scale. So after considering the historical or recent usage of the ties, there we go, we considered the available space to be that space that would be available at least 85% of the hours of the year. Substantially higher constraints would work against the ability to finance a project based on an intermittent access to the New York market. And I'm not going to read through this, but we developed a whole series of other assumptions that impacted the amount of potential supply that could get to New York and the costs of getting it there.
Again, all this will be available through the DMM website.
Okay, great.
So I think, thank you, Bob. That was great. I think if folks have questions on the other resources, we can come back during the Q&A. At this point, we're going to switch the mic over to Uday, who's a principal at CPI. Maybe while I switch slides, one comment, Bob, you could just add is on imports. Just maybe make a brief comment on the sensitivity to the large-scale imports that we did. And then, Uday, if you can speak to the bridge between the options paper.
Sure. So in the base case, we had assumed that the eligibility matched the RPS main tier. We did do a sensitivity analysis, which is summarized in the cost study, which was kind of a what if. What if there was a new 1,000 megawatt transmission facility from Quebec into downstate New York? That might look a lot like the Central Hudson Power Express. And what if large hydro was eligible? We estimated the cost of that large hydro on something of an opportunity cost basis. If it was competing head-to-head, what would it need to bid to be able to compete with other supply? We did not include the cost of that facility in the analysis. That's really a policy decision as to exactly where those costs would be borne. but we did take a look at what allowing basically 1,000 megawatts of large hydro to be part of the supply curve would do to the overall costs, and those results are presented.
Great, thanks, Bob.
So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some additional work to follow up on the options paper that was published in June of last year. And to remind everyone, the options paper was complementary to the work that's done here, preceded it a bit, and some issues that are relevant have changed since then, in particular the extension of the PTC. But in addition, we've received a number of comments, and we thought this was, and the idea is to discuss a few sensitivities that might be helpful moving forward to address some of the issues that were raised in the intervening now 8 or 9 months. So let me go through and I'll discuss a couple of the key sensitivities that we're going to. Oh, let me go back. I think I just double clicked. So so let me start by describing a couple of the key circumstances that have changed. One is that we have seen a long-term extension of the PTC with a phase-out. And one of the, in the options paper, the base case was one that assumed no PTC extension. And here we want to explore in a little bit more detail a couple of the cases with the PTC. And in particular, one of the issues that has been raised is the question of the value associated with wind facilities post the usual 20-year assumed life of these facilities. It's an issue that was raised qualitatively and discussed in the options paper, but wasn't modeled. And one of the key sensitivities that we're going to address here and discuss is modeling that includes this 21 through 30-year period. And we're going to be focusing on those cases looking in particular at the case where the PTC is assumed as well, given the relevance again of this case because of the extension of the PTC. Secondly, we had mentioned qualitatively again in the options paper that utility-owned generation procurement mechanisms could address one of the potential downsides of utility-owned generation that we'd brought up in that paper, which is that with utility-owned generation, if a renewable asset is owned by a utility and placed in rate-based and owned as a regulated asset, then the ratepayer cost is essentially determined by the cost paid for the asset. Now, this means that if, for instance, it's a wind facility and you happen to have underestimated how much the power the facility will produce because your wind estimation happened to be off for some reason, then the ratepayer would bear that risk. And there are ways that we suggested in the options paper that this could be addressed. And one of the sensitivities that we're running here is to assume that one of these mechanisms has been put in place and to ask what removing that bias does in terms of comparing utility-owned generation to long-term contracting. Third, one of the interesting questions that arises if you look at, again, this value in post 20 years of wind and wind assets is, well, are there ways that not only with utility-owned generation but with power purchase agreements, 20-year contracts, what are the ways that you can think about acquiring those same renewable attributes for those last 10 years? What are the different ways that you can do it? What are the different options, and how do they cost out? So we'll discuss a few options there and compare the costs for those options. And then finally, some of the comments that we had about the options paper had to do with the impact of different assumed long-term costs of equity, in particular, associated that we ought to be assuming for assets that were provided long-term PPAs. And so we present the results of a few sensitivities that in particular consider sort of the case of higher than expected cost of equity. And the motivation for this is in financial markets, there was we've had a significant shift over the last year. Some low-cost financing vehicles known as yieldcos have shown themselves so far not to be terribly viable. And so we wanted to make sure that we've considered the possibility that cost of equity would be higher than expected as well. So I'll go through some of those results, and just to be clear, in the options report, in order to make sure that this is comparable, we haven't changed any of the physical assumptions and the underlying cost assumptions from the options report, so it's completely comparable in that sense to the report from 6 months ago, and it isn't necessarily also updated to reflect the full cost study here, so that's one caveat. The main difference that we make here is in considering that extension of useful life. And the goal of this, again, is to ask about the relative impact of some of these sensitivities on different potential procurement mechanisms and options, and for that purpose, this is sufficient. The main issue in terms of the project life is we're asking what happens if these projects, these wind facilities, actually are usable for 30 years rather than 20 years.
Let me interrupt for 1 second.
Sorry about that. I realized I didn't forward that.
At the risk of stating the obvious, as I mentioned earlier, this presentation was included in response to a number of questions that we had received about this issue as presented in the LSR options paper. Its inclusion today should not be read to imply that staff has changed its position in any way or manner regarding the issue of utility-owned generation or PPAs from what was expressed in the white paper. And again, this is just meant to respond to some of the inquiries that some interested parties had regarding an updating of this data.
Thank you. So let me. So again, these are the old assumptions, and again, this is available. I realize this is very hard to read, and I apologize for that. So let me just go through. So in this case, we're considering 2 of the 3 basic procurement options that we looked at in the previous case. One is the bundled PPA option, in this case with the production tax credit assumed at full value. And in this case, we're looking at adding, some of the options that we're looking at here, 2 of them basically. One is an option to extend the power purchase agreement that is part of the 20-year contract out through 30 years. Where we've made some technical assumptions about what happens to production in the out years. We assume that to be conservative, that the production of the wind facility is 15% less than what may have been expected for those last 10 years, and that the equity that investors, particularly equity investors, are demanding a premium in terms of a return for including that time period in the analysis of their bidding prices. And then secondly, we also consider options where there is an extension with a 10-year REC-only contract with 3 different fixed prices, $20, $40, and $60 a megawatt hour. For utility-owned generation, again, we assume we're asking, well, what if we look at a 30-year asset life for a utility-owned generation, again, with that reduced production in the out years. And we, again, as I mentioned earlier, are looking at this utility procurement case where the estimation bias is no longer held by ratepayers, but is shifted to developers. Oops. And as far as financial assumptions goes, the one point I would make is that we do look at a range of, we look at an increased long-term equity return requirement for the utility-backed PPA. We leave the assumed developer returns the same for all cases. So there are 2 different returns here in terms of equity. There is an owner of a project who's developing it. We assume that they're getting the same return in all of these cases. And then there's the entity that owns the asset in the long term. In this case, we assume that the asset is purchased by the long-term owner at the time that it comes into operation. And that long-term return expectation is what we've looked at increasing in the PPA case as a sensitivity. And then finally, there is another return, which is the long-term return that they may expect in the out years for 21 through 30, which we also look at a range of options for. So let me just go through the results, and they're just 3 slides, so hopefully this won't take too long. The first point to make is that when one compares, looking at a 30-year life and comparing to the case where you have a utility-based backed PPA with an option for the to extend that PPA by 10 years, so the ability to say, I want the PPA for 10 more years at the same price. When comparing that to utility-owned generation and rate base, we find that the utility-owned generation case, in the presence of a PTC, could save ratepayers about $4 a megawatt hour relative to the 20-year PPA with the extension of 10 years over that 30-year period. So on a levelized basis, it's a $4 a megawatt hour savings over a base cost of about $64 a megawatt hour in this case. Further, if we also look at the second question of what if we assume that procurement mechanisms are shifted to make sure that the risk of underperformance is held by developers rather than by ratepayers, that can again save about $3 to $4 a megawatt hour for ratepayers. So those are the 2 main results regarding how, in this longer term case, the residual value can affect the relative benefits of a long-term contract, a PPA, relative to utility-owned generation. And with these 2 sensitivities show that there are a couple of different ways that one could save additional money through utility-owned generation relative to a PPA for a 30-year lifespan with a PTC. And as a reminder, one of the reasons why you see this, and it's a key assumption here, the assumption here is that, and there are 2 of them, in all cases, the production tax credit is assumed to be fully utilized by either the investor in the PPA or the utility and is used as it's generated, so they have the tax capacity to do so. And secondly, that any such benefit in the case of utility-owned generation is fully passed through to ratepayers, so that as and when it's generated, so that if there's a PTC that the utility can utilize, there's a full offset of that PTC in ratepayer costs while it's being generated. So those are 2 important assumptions. Secondly, I wanted to talk about the different ways in which you can look at a long-term PPA extension, or looking at ways to procure that energy and RECs in those last 10 years. And the main point here is that the option to extend could be very valuable for ratepayers, and that a REC-only procurement in those last 10 years without that option to extend could be quite a bit more costly, between $1 and $7 a megawatt hour more costly. So if you don't put that option into the 20-year PPA, you might end up paying a lot more later on if you try to procure those RECs. And these 10 to 20, the different options I've looked at is if you pay $20, $40, or $60 a megawatt hour, you find that those costs can be substantial. And then finally, I wanted to, and this is the main point of this slide, is just to say that if you do shift, if there are changes, for example, in the cost of equity over time, if we find that, for example, long-term investors are going to charge more because interest rates have gone up and the like, on the equity side, again, ignoring debt, on the equity side, if long-term equity costs more than we expect, the differences, particularly over a 20-year period, are not huge. It's about $1 a megawatt hour. And we've done a few other cases. They're a bit more technical. I won't go into detail, but they will be happy to discuss with anyone who's interested. But again, these are not very large effects, is the main takeaway here. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, we'll turn to questions and answers. And to start it off, somewhere here, I have a question that we were carrying over from this morning from Roger. And it is, this again goes to a question about where are the capacity factors coming from. Page 34, Tier 1 cumulative capacity deployed graph, and the spreadsheet with the values proposes 18 megawatts of deployed land-based wind that produces 55 gigawatt hours of power from page 35, Tier 1 cumulative generation. That works out to 35% capacity factor, which is significantly different from the statewide average capacity factor for land-based wind in 2014 of 28%. Robert.
So there are a couple of things going on there. First of all, that is a number that actually isn't from our supply curve analysis. That represents the very beginning of this analysis, which are currently contracted main tier projects. So those are the expected contractual values from the first projects that would come online after 1/1/2015, I believe. That being said, there's been a lot of evolution in the in land-based wind over the course of the last 10 years of development. We have an existing fleet that was built with older technology, with lower hub heights, and in effect, we are seeing now a project built in the same location as one built 10 years ago would most likely have a higher capacity factor. So it's not at all an unexpected result to see a modern project be getting a better result than the New York's kind of first generation of commercial scale wind projects.
Thank you very much.
Seth Kaplan, EDP Renewables. I'm struggling to understand this construct where the utility has ownership.
I need to turn the mic on, please.
Sorry, I thought it was on. Yeah, I'm sorry. Seth Kaplan, EDP Renewables. I'm just trying to understand this construct where the utility owns, but the risk of underperformance remains with presumably the opportunity for overperformance remains with the developer. Just as a practical matter, it's hard to imagine a developer doing that unless they maintain operation. Because sometimes the underperformance is due to bad operation. So if you're asking someone to take on that operation, to take that risk, they would need to be operating it. Whether you're structuring in a payment to pay the developer to operate it after they no longer own it. And also, I would imagine, just the thought experiment, if you were working in the finance department of a developer, what your reaction to wearing that risk would be to your pricing, and whether the increased risk to the developer that you're asking the developer to wear might, in fact, offset the benefit that you're seeing by raising the price as the developer protects itself against the risk that you're shifting to them.
Sure. And so what I have in mind here primarily, particularly, is the risk, and what we've modeled, to be clear, is really the risk associated with resource bias, estimation bias. So it's not really operational in that sense. It's resource estimation bias. So it's a subset of operations risk that we've really modeled here. And what I have in mind isn't the risk over the entire lifetime, but the idea that, for example, the payment for the project over the first few years would be performance-based. That is, over the first 2 or 3 years, the payment for the operating project would be adjusted up or down based on performance, which is something that, as we've discussed, is something that we've seen done in the past in other areas anyway. And so, in that case, this is a situation where a chunk of the resource estimation bias is left with the developer, and while there is still operational risk that's left with the utility, again, what we're modeling is primarily the operations risk associated with that, or what I really mean is this resource estimation bias risk.
So that just to understand what you're saying,
yeah.
So you're assuming some sort of regime where you've got anemometers up and you're charging back a cost based upon there just being less wind, even if it's producing the contracted amount of megawatt hours?
There is everybody has something like a P50 case for how much they're expecting of production from the facility for the first few years. And there's, you had anemometers up before. You think you know how much it's going to produce. And when you put the wind turbines up there, you find out that because of maybe some things that you didn't quite account for, there's a little bit less than you expected, or a little bit more. And there's some adjustment in payment made to account for that.
Okay, but then the last thing is just to kind of return to the financial issue of whether in your modeling you account for the developer raising price to cover the risk that you're shifting back to them.
Yeah, and so in principle, this could, and so we've looked at sort of changes in developer expected returns for this. I didn't include an increase in developer return in that case, but I've modeled that in the past. And what I can tell you is that it's significantly less. It's about on the order of less than $1 a megawatt hour for accounting for this shift of risk. We think that this is a risk that developers are much better suited to bear. It's the natural place for that resource estimation risk to lie. And so this is a case where it's more efficient for the developer to bear it in the first place. And so we think that makes it so it's not surprising that it wouldn't overcome this difference. Oh, and I should be one more thing I should mention. The reason for this is that we had assumed that the utility itself was always in the options paper. The utility was assumed because the utility was bearing that risk. The utility capacity factor was discounted relative to the PPA case. And so this is undoing that bias against the utility. And so this is a little bit more of an even playing field, assuming that this kind of mechanism is in place.
Jordan Giroux, Pace Energy and Climate Center. Just a couple of clarifying questions. First, just to be sure, I noticed we switched to a new presentation. Will these slides also be available? Okay. Second, just to make sure I understand exactly how you framed your results, you mentioned $3 to $4 shift due to putting risk on developers, $3 to $4 shift based on comparing UOG over a 30-year period versus a 10-year extension. Is that shift relative to the results you had over the summer, or is that the delta now between UOG and PPAs in this adjusted model?
The delta now.
Okay. And lastly, you led in with some mention of the fact that one of the key sensitivities you modeled was around a higher developer IRR. And I don't know if I just missed it, or if that was not something that you pointed to in your summary of results, but maybe you could return to that point a little bit and tell us how it factors into this.
Yes, sorry. What I should say, it wasn't quite a developer IRR, but rather a long-term equity investor IRR in the PPA case. So this is, again, assuming that a developer develops it and then sells the project, in one case with utility-owned generation, to a utility which puts it in rate base. In the other case, if with a long-term power purchase agreement, either with an option to extend or not, to a long-term investor and owner of the asset. And the main sensitivities are really around the equity returns demanded by that long-term investor. And so those are the sensitivities that are on this very busy slide. I apologize. And so these are sensitivities associated with either, and some fraction of those sensitivities, the first three, are really about the assumed returns that they're looking, the discount rate that they apply for those last 10 years of operation, years 21 through 30. The bottom two sensitivities are actually changing the discount rate or the returns that they're requiring, either over the first 20 years or over that full 30-year period.
Thanks. Well, I look forward to being able to review these, and thank you.
No problem.
Hi, I'm Doug Feaster with the Renewables Consulting Group. I wanted to go back to the offshore wind analysis, and I was a little bit surprised at the analysis concerning interconnect, that there wasn't It was the view that there wasn't an interconnect possibility on Long Island, that the interconnect would have to happen, it looks like, in New York City. And so, one, I wanted to see whether it would be possible to see that internal analysis, that NYSERDA analysis from 2012 that Siemens TDI performed. I don't know if that's possible. And secondly, I was wondering whether the 2009 study that Con Ed and LIPA jointly did on offshore wind was referenced or used at all here. It did show 700 megawatts could be interconnected in eastern Queens and then split between the two distribution systems of Con Ed and LIPA. So I didn't know if that was factored in and then somehow discounted or whatever, but I just wanted to ask those two questions.
So it may be more appropriate for NYSERDA to talk about the Siemens stuff that they commissioned in terms of. Sure. So the analysis did not consider that 2009 NYPA analysis. It again used the most recent site-specific information that was available. So not. One of the interesting things about that analysis was it started with a series of sites and what would it take to connect that scale of supply. It probably was not a developer optimized perspective, but rather something of a static analysis. If you locate here and you need to deliver that much, what would it cost? So that's certainly an area where the transmission and connection costs are very important and a significant magnitude for offshore wind. We'd certainly welcome better data if it's available, more recent data, more specific data. We're working with a big driver on which there's not a lot of good information available in the public sector.
Can I just understand that your answer to that is that the 2009 study was just too old and you had more recent information? I'm not sure if I understood it was just too out of date?
Well, really, it wasn't considered. There was a more recent New York specific study.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we can certainly look into what further detailed assumptions we can share on those offshore wind, and we'd certainly welcome, as Bob said, I want to reiterate, if you have interconnection thoughts in terms of costs and locations, please submit them.
I just know that Con Ed and LIPA, along with NYPA, looked at this fairly closely before they submitted their bid to the federal government for the lease area off the Rockaways. So, yep.
Keith Shue with Otsego 2000. Just some really just technical questions. When I was looking at the graphs that were presented for the advancements in technology for wind, I noticed some pretty optimistic capacity factors that were like upwards of 40 to 45% if I saw the graph right. I don't think it appears in the cost study yet. We'll get that, I guess, when the whole thing's available. But can you explain where that came from? Were they kind of linear projections off of advancements that have happened historically with wind, or were there's some other science involved to come up with those high levels of capacity factor?
So specifically, I'm sorry, you're referring to land-based wind or the offshore wind?
Well, wind. I'm trying to remember the slide. I think the slide was not specific, maybe for offshore or onshore wind, but I was seeing numbers of upwards of 40, 45.
Okay, those are the offshore. Those are the offshore wind numbers, and those are consistent with. One of the reasons people are looking to develop offshore is the winds are much stronger than available onshore. So those are numbers that are really supported by every study I've ever seen for offshore. I think that's why people are paying attention to developing in what's otherwise a pretty harsh and more expensive environment to develop.
Okay, maybe I was thinking onshore when I saw the slide. For onshore wind, and somebody called in talking about 28% versus 35% capacity factor. How does that size up? In terms of your projections for onshore wind capacity?
So for onshore capacity, our partner in this project, AWS True Power, who's one of the leading meteorology firms, happens to be based here in Albany, did that part of the geospatial analysis where each of the sites that was identified has modeled wind speed, and it was modeled as being put through a commercially available power curve. Typical loss factors, I think they're 21% for the various sources of losses were applied, and then those numbers were trended over time as we described. The results are consistent with what we're seeing in projects that are being bid and built now, that the numbers that we're seeing are higher than those historically as we look at projects that are being developed all over the country, but particularly in the Northeast. There have been advances in low-speed wind turbine technology, which are more effective at getting higher capacity factors out of given wind speeds. We're seeing a movement industry-wide to taller turbines and longer blades that capture more wind and create more energy on a given piece of land. So those are expectations we've seen. We regularly interview developers and have been doing this for the last 12 years, 3 times a year, to really benchmark people's expectations, and we've been tracking how these numbers have been coming up over time, the assumptions of people that are actually bidding and getting contracts, and trust me that their financiers are really hard on those numbers and don't end up bidding at expectations that they don't believe they can realize. So we are seeing, it is not at all uncommon to see in the Northeast capacity factors that are well into the 30s and occasionally into the low 40s of capacity factors for individual project sites that we've looked at and developers that we've talked to. The modeling came out pretty consistent with that. In New York, it's not a great land-based wind area. There are very few projects. There are a few sites that were modeled as having capacity factors up in the 40s. They tended to be small sites, remote from transmission, and ended up not being the ones that were modeled as being deployed because they were, even though they had great capacity factors, they were too expensive to build and to get the power to market. Most of the supply curve that was deployed is supply that's in the mid-30s of capacity factors, and we're seeing those types of projects all over the region. It's actually quite conservative to what we're seeing in the windy Midwest, where we're starting to see projects that actually get over 50% capacity factor at times. It's remarkable how, and you can look at some of the DOE, Lawrence Berkeley Labs, National Wind reports that track this evolution over time, and it's been a significant advance in the technology.
Yeah, it definitely has. I mean, I'm interested in how is it going to relate to what's achievable in New York State, obviously. The solar capacity factors, it was very clear in the cost analysis that was available. They had examples of what that has been over the last several years in different places, and that's pretty easy to track for solar capacity factor. To me, it's a little tougher subject to talk about with wind because of all the different variables. But I would be interested to see what the background data that contributed to those numbers were, and also for all the projections that occurred relating to both solar and wind. And for capacity, when you did capacity factor and worked in your projections, regardless of what the issue was, financing or what have you, were those changes in capacity factor and changes in technology worked into those models too, or were there fixed assumptions about things like capacity factor when you were doing other modeling of other aspects of the CES?
So, if I understand the question correctly, we assumed that there would be an evolution of both of capital expense of operation and maintenance, and for wind of capacity of hub height and capacity factor over time, as we continue to look at available data of where those trends are going. We did not assume that the capacity factor of solar was changing over time. We're pretty much limited to how much sun falls on the Earth, and technology isn't going to change that. The technology advances that happen may allow you to get a little bit more higher conversion efficiency over time, but to the extent that we are making all of our calculations on a per unit basis, on a per megawatt basis, that kind of falls out of the math. So that evolution is really captured within the cost trajectory.
On the solar, I guess one other question relating to that. The green tech estimate showed the cost going down and then kind of going back up, and you all said that you felt that was probably not appropriate. Can you explain where they came up with that expectation that the cost would start to rise again, and why you all decided that it wouldn't?
Frankly, I can't explain what came into or how they derived that forecast. Prior to that, we've regularly done an amalgamation of available forecasts and considered all publicly available trend estimates, and every other trend estimate that we've seen continues a cost decline, although as with most maturing technology, that the rate of change kind of asymptotically levels out. It just seemed like we hadn't seen any other examples of solar that turned around and started going back up a couple of years from now, and frankly, it's I can't really explain how they came up with that.
I'll just ask one last question.
Mm-hmm.
In light of what we now know with the PTC and the extension, but also the phase out, basically you have some assurance, but it ends too.
Mm-hmm.
Does that create some perhaps rethinking about whether we should be backloading versus front loading some of our investments for things for renewables such as wind?
Well, it's an excellent question, and maybe it's one of the right questions to ask. Ultimately, that's a policy question that is beyond my scope.
I think one of the findings that was summarized by Carl this morning was that factor, as well as a number of the other elements that we introduced, from a staff point of view, indicates that this is a good time to be procuring renewable resources.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris?
And as you're walking away, just this is a general apply. So in terms of the afternoon slides, UDI slides are new. They're in response to options paper questions, but all of Bob's slides are in the cost study. In fact, there are more. So it's a thick deck, so I encourage you to look through them, and you'll see all the same data there. We're going to repost these, but it'll be therefore in two places, the original cost study and in our subsequent deck. So before maybe we get formal requests for additional data, please just scrutinize the 300 slides that we've already published so you make sure that they're not in there. Thank you.
Hi, Chris Raup with Con Edison. I had a question, I think, for Bob related to the in-state versus out-of-state question that I brought up this morning. So there's a slide, I'm not sure if it was up on the screen earlier, but it shows the imports that satisfy the REC requirements. And it looked like the imports was a kind of a small fraction of the total, eyeball maybe like kind of 5%. And that felt a little strange to me, because I look at the transmission constraints, and it seems like there's room to move RECs and energy into New York State, even if you just kind of restrict it to PJM. It seems like there's the capability there. So I'm curious, why is it that imports satisfy such a small amount of the total need? And I'm assuming, by the way, that wind built in PJM is probably a little bit less expensive than wind built in New York, just kind of based on local cost of doing business and so forth.
So, great question, and actually I had initially expected to see maybe a larger impact, so I understand why you're curious why it showed so little. I think there are a few reasons. There was some degree of conservatism built into the analysis, some of the reasons that I described. One assumption that if we have a supply curve like the one we described in New York and each of the surrounding areas, if we made a simplifying assumption that native demand eats first to a degree. There are significant RPS targets in eastern PJM. If you look at the maps of the resource potential in PJM, the vast majority of it is Ohio West. The kind of bottled on the other side of constraints. The PJM East and West markets are separate markets that are heavily characterized by those East-West constraints. And with the rapidly increasing PJM East RPS targets, there just isn't that much of what we think is realistic developable potential in PJM East to go around. It's turned out to be pretty hard to site wind in PJM East. It's turned out to be pretty easy to site it in PJM West. So the ability for PJM, for example, to contribute is probably, as we're seeing it, heavily dependent on whether there's new transmission built to get supply through. Realistically, there may be a few projects built in PJM that are, somebody sells into New York first and not into PJM. Rather than kind of coming afterwards, so that simplifying sequencing assumption is one that if relaxed or done in a more comprehensive and complex market modeling, you might see a little bit more coming in. Some of the other areas we looked at, again, it was a simplified analysis to try to look at the entire eastern continent, but coming through constrained areas, while there are transmission limitations, you end up having either significant basis risk or significant cost to move, say, through northern New Jersey. On the Ontario, the Quebec existing tie is extremely heavily used. We really didn't see any reliable use of that for a long-term financing play without building new transmission. Ontario, we were subject to substantial costs or volumetric constraints. And the cost curve is fairly flat, and when you deal with in some of the interfaces between losses, basis risk, and cost of moving power, it does add some cost, and when you consider that, it diminished the amount that would be shown. I think in a spot market situation where somebody might build for another reason, not be looking to New York to finance, you might see some more opportunistic imports come in from time to time over non-firm transmission opportunities, given that our analysis was really a long-term contracting basis. That was something that wouldn't be considered in that analysis framework. Does that help?
Thank you, Chris.
One quick technical question. For the solar analysis that you did, were you assuming kind of hourly prices for the solar, or did you assume sort of average prices during the day?
We, in terms of the market value,
yes.
we did a production-weighted market value. So we took an hourly production profile. We overlaid that on an hourly New York ISO historical profile to understand a weighted average value, and then we trended that weighted average value over time.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Peter, are you positioned to ask a question, or are you just hanging out there?
No, I'm not asking a question.
Okay.
He's
Before you ask your question, I just want to acknowledge one question that came in this afternoon. The question is from TransCanada Power Marketing. Will the existing competitive retail supply electricity contracts be grandfathered from the new CES? There's nothing in the CES that would impair any existing contract. That said, clearly the CES imposes new obligations upon LSEs in a retail supply setting.
Great, thank you. Radmila Militich with Independent Power Producers. I have a question about the sensitivity analysis for Champlain-Hudson Power Express transmission line and large hydro. And I'm hoping you can clarify why the cost of the transmission line should not be included in the cost of the hydro when the transmission line is essentially an extension cord for HQ's large hydro.
The fact that we didn't analyze that cost was not meant to be presumptive that it shouldn't be included in the cost. I think as we talked about what information would be useful to produce, we identified what that source of supply might cost, and the question of how that transmission would be paid for was left outside of our analysis as a policy question. I think, Eric or Carl, anything you'd want to add to that?
I mean, I guess just so we don't leave you with more doubt. So they are, in that sensitivity, that resource is being paid a premium. And the assumption is that that premium plus the market revenues are going to cover all the costs to get its energy into that zone.
Okay, thank you.
I see it's 3 o'clock. Can I get an indication of if there's anybody else that wants to be asking any questions? If not, you get to wrap up.
Lucky day. Clint Plummer, Deepwater Wind. Thanks again.
That means one question.
One question in 7 parts, right? So actually, all of this really does come back to that issue of transmission. So just a couple of questions to clarify what was in and what was out. I understand the decision that was made about hydro. When we talk about land-based wind, were transmission costs required to make land-based wind at scale deliverable included in the cost analysis?
So we included, again, the extension cord costs plus an assumption for network upgrade costs. Network upgrade costs are extremely site-specific. The kind of doing a site-by-site interconnection study for the entire region was beyond our scope. We assumed a level of costs that was consistent with doing a substantial network upgrade to get wind supply out of northern New York into southern New York, and what that might cost on a per megawatt hour basis if used at a high capacity factor with potentially a hydro blend, as a ballpark number to account for the scale of that cost. Beyond that, the assumption is that we have another analysis going on contemporaneously, the State Resource Plan, which colleagues here can talk more about, that is intended to take a closer look at what those costs might be and sharpen what was an approximate approach that we took.
Understood. Second part of that is, did you apply the same consideration to utility scale solar deliverability costs?
We assumed, actually, I think that was a slide we ended up dropping out of it, so I don't have it at my fingertips. If you give me a second we made slightly different assumptions for projects of different scale. We basically assumed that actually, Po, if you could, find me what page it's on and just let me know. Categorically, some value was included. We assumed that level of cost that I just described for larger land-based wind projects that don't really get to choose where they, where the good winds are, and often are in places with substantial transmission constraints. For a 10, 20, 30 megawatt utility scale solar project, we generally assumed that they would be better able to locate at better locations on the system, and so that they at least the first several, or the first many installations probably would be able to find places where they might be assigned less, proportionally less of the non-reimbursable or the assigned network upgrade costs. Okay, so for large land-based wind, we assume more or less 100% of those costs that I described earlier. For land-based wind less than 20 megawatts, we assumed 50%. For utility scale solar, we assumed 10%, and for those are the ones that you were asking about. So the underlying assumption there again was that some types of resources are better able to locate or choose from among the many locations they could go to find the places where they aren't going to trigger major network upgrades.
just to clarify the numbers you were putting out there, that 100% to 10%, that was
So that's multiplied by that number I described earlier. That was that $30 a kilowatt year type of an adder. That was the network upgrade.
understood. Okay.
Cost assumption.
Okay, and then last question was, as it. Oh, great. Well, don't worry. I can
Related.
pull it
It's
up.
good.
How much time do we have? So, last question. Seriously, when you did the analysis of the interconnection capacity for offshore wind, it appears that you were assuming that for each site there needed to be one point of interconnection. Can you talk through your logic on why you think that you need to deliver 2,000 megawatts into a single point of interconnection rather than splitting it up?
Yeah, I think ultimately we didn't perform a transmission analysis ourselves. We were that was outside the scope of what we had to work with. So we utilized the analysis that was available that had made those assumptions. So certainly, I would neither question transmission experts at Siemens PTI that I could do what they do better, but at the same time, there was I can imagine that there are targeted approaches that developers would take to try to, in the face of potentially really high cost, to try to figure out how to build a better mousetrap and figure out how to interconnect most effectively. So any information that's available that could help sharpen these types of analyses up, we'd certainly welcome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for all of you who participated here in Albany or via the internet. We appreciate your interest. We will have the slides posted by tomorrow and look forward to receiving your comments. Thank you.